Go Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yalmin of Revolution, and this is a World War III alert. We have a World War III alert. First, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button, like, share, subscribe. You're in the House of Revolution, and we're gonna jump right into this. So much information we got to get into. The Venezuelan information is the most important, because that's a war that America is definitely finna start, and they're trying to have a coup d'etat over there. Israel bombs the Lebanese capital today. We could be at war tonight behind that. It could be a civil war in Israel as they try to break into the prisons to free soldiers. We're going to get into all of that.
Only mission here on this show is the truth. We have no agenda, and we are not financed by any sort of big tech companies or anybody. We are supported by you guys and the few sponsors that we have here on the show. So thank you guys for joining us. But we do start with some breaking news today.
Well, World War III is about to get started because of retaliatory attacks in the Middle East. So right now, just a short time ago, Israeli Air Force dropped bombs on southern Beirut, a civilian area, no less, of Lebanon's capital. Now, Israel says that they are targeting a senior Hezbollah commander in Beirut in this suburb in retaliation.
This is very disrespectful. We could be at World War III right now. Behind this, Israel just did the false flag. We already seen the reports. It was them and their air defense missile, which fell on Syrian-occupied territory, killed Syrians. But here's the Israelis saying they killed a top Hezbollah commander because he supposed to have something with Syrians getting killed. Remember, no Israelis got killed. But what they're doing is they're hoping Hezbollah strike back real hard so they can do something to bring the Americans into this war.
For an attack on Saturday that killed 12 people. So if we are trying to keep track, it really is a fool's errand, because we have a chicken and egg phenomenon going on here, because Hezbollah attacked Israel in retaliation for Israel attacks in Lebanon, which killed 12 people, including children. So now Israel retaliated for the retaliation. Now Hezbollah continues to up this ante in retaliation for Gaza attacks by the Israeli army. Israel's retaliating so we cannot go back. We just cannot peel this. We can peel the onion until we get nowhere, right? So right now, this is retaliation for retaliation for retaliation. And as a reminder, Hezbollah only exists to retaliate against Israel for the 1982 attack on Lebanon. So no retaliation, you guys, is ever going to solve this. And any media that leaves that out only wants more war. The only way to stop this is peace talks, which none of these leaders is even discussing. Now the U.S. is saying that it will defend Israel if this escalates.
Of course they will.
It's not an if. The hypothetical is gone. It did escalate. Israel just escalated. So Lloyd Austin today said, well, now if Lebanon comes back and retaliates against this retaliation, which was a retaliation, well, then we'll be there for Israel. He said, if Israel is attacked, we will help Israel to defend itself. We've been clear about that from the very beginning. But again, we don't want to see that happening.
So yeah, that already happened. And the U.S. State Department, of course, issuing alerts. Any Americans, any civilians in that area, get out right now.
Yes.
This is descending into absolute chaos right now. What will Russia do? Russia going to sit idly by and watch right now as Hezbollah then goes into war with Israel and does nothing? Of course, they are not going to sit idly by, and they certainly are not going to sit idly by as Iran gets attacked.
Right.
So they will, of course, talk about Hezbollah.
It's going to be a big time war.
And attacking Iranian Hezbollah backed proxy targets, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Iran or other locations, and Russia will not sit back kindly and watch this happen either.
I mean, you guys, what did these civilians do? And, Israel continues to use the excuse that these leaders are in civilian areas, so it's fair game. But that is against all international law to target civilians, even if there are perpetrators in these areas. So the one thing we care about more than anything else, more than these leaders, more than these groups, more than these names and religions, is the civilians.
The thing is, Hezbollah is not Hamas. Hamas over there fighting a guerrilla war. Hezbollah don't have to fight a guerrilla war. They can fight a regular war and bomb Tel Aviv, which they will do.
And so civilians will inevitably die, and they are dying. And no leader is saying this should just stop, full stop.
No, that's exactly what's going to happen. The blood will be shed and this region will descend into chaos. But the United States, of course, is going to stand by or is going to join the fight. Do you want the United States to join the fight? Do you want United States men and women to be involved in this massive regional war? I ask you, what does it benefit the United States to get involved in a war in the Middle East? The answer is, well, I don't want to lead the witness. You guys tell me. Does it benefit the United States in any way to go to war in the Middle East? Absolutely. Well, again, I'm not going to lead the witness. You guys tell me about this.
Well, this one comment from Pirate X says, leave Israel alone, but the bombing. But the civilians, this is the story. This is what will pull us all in. And again, I'm not going to peel the onion and say who struck first, because that's going to take us all the way back to 1982 and further. So what is to be done now is to not solve retaliation for retaliation. Is somebody say, we're going to turn the other cheek. We're not going to solve this with bombs.
Or a false flag. A retaliation for a false flag is essentially what this is. And an Iron Dome is what really ended up killing those 12 individuals in the Golan Heights. So who's retaliating for what? Their own Iron Dome killing their own citizens? I mean, okay, or that's what we're going to start using. I mean, we know that Israel loves false flags, so to use that as a convenience to be able to launch a full-scale attack against Hezbollah, like on October 7th, right? So that is what we're looking at right now in Lebanon as night falls there and this attack unfolds. What will be the response now from Hezbollah to Tel Aviv, inside of Israel, for this attack on the southern Beirut in the civilian area in Lebanon? We'll be watching it very, very closely.
And what leaders, name one in the chat, are speaking for peace? What leaders, either elected or candidates, are speaking to de-escalate in this region? What is our hope at this point? Because the Democratic Party that is currently in office is not saying that they will back down or push for peace in any form or fashion. Do we even have a vote in this, or are we, as Western taxpayers, dragged into a war for bloodlust? Just let me know what you think. Well, speaking of bloodlust, we have more news to get to. We're going to talk about the CIA-backed involvement in the Venezuela election that just happened. We're also going to talk about civil war in Israel due to IDF soldiers being actually held accountable for their abuse of Palestine.
Now, those two topics, I didn't even know they were going to get into this Israel. So those three things are what we're talking about today. That's the sermon today. Israel pulling the U.S. into World War III because they cannot defeat nobody. That's just the truth. Dragging the U.S. in to a war the U.S. definitely can't win. That's very disrespectful. So they want the U.S. to surrender also. This is crazy. But this is how empires fall, and it's definitely going to fall with this one. The CIA-backed coup in Venezuela, which was stopped. Maduro, the revolutionary, he won. Lies is being spread on the news. We're going to get into that. But we need to understand, why is the U.S. talking about Venezuela election so much? What are you talking about? Tell Saudi Arabia to have an election. Tell Kuwait to have an election. Tell the United Arab Emirates to have one. But the Venezuelan elections are the most secure. We're getting that. But they want to steal that oil. You see what I'm saying? They want to steal that oil. But they also know Putin's setting up Venezuela and Cuba to be able to deal with the U.S. when this big World War III happens. So the U.S. is really finna make the move on Venezuela, for Venezuela can be an access to bring them down. But Venezuela ready for a war. You know, it's just that the U.S. has no good options. It's nowhere they can win. Nothing. Not in China, not Ukraine, not North Korea. I told y'all this a year ago. It's no good options for NATO. Nowhere are they going to beat anybody in anything. But they got to make their move, and make their move soon, because everybody all around the globe is getting strengthened with the Russian weapons. And it seems like the U.S. has decided to start with Venezuela.
Palestinian prisoners, that's not new. We're pretending that it's new, but it's not. So we're going to talk to Dan Cohen about that, plus what white dudes think of Kamala Harris. I mean, I want to know what all people think of everything, but why this group and why this party and what is the message? We're going to look at that. But first, we want to tell you about our friends at American Financing, because in today's economy, of course, the stress of providing for a family and yourself.
Well, if you've ever wanted to see what a CIA-backed coup and color revolution looks like in action, we're clearly witnessing it all over again right now in Venezuela, where the democratically elected government of Nicolas Maduro just won re-election. The CIA-backed opposition failed miserably, but that's not stopping the Biden administration and corporate media from doing everything they can right now to discredit that election and push for a civil war, which I don't know that they understand fully what's about to happen and what would happen to the United States if a civil war unfolds. And Elon
they
Musk
don't care about us, y'all. Y'all don't understand this, bro. If Venezuela becomes more unstable and Maduro run the right-wing radicals out of Venezuela, they come here. Guess who these people is committing all these crimes all over America? Yes, they're the Venezuelans, but they're right-wing radicals that Maduro is running out the country. He's running them and their families out the country. They done betrayed their country. Yes. The same thing happened with Cuba. This exact thing happened with Cuba. Castro came to power. He ran all the traitors up out of Cuba, landed in Miami, and they've been sitting there talking shit since the 60s and been committing crimes and making movies like Scarface. This is serious business. We don't want no Venezuelan Scarface movie. 50 Cent, do you hear me? We don't keep your crap Venezuelan kingpin movies. But it's going to be hell on us. It's going to be hell on us once all those migrants have to come here. Millions of them come here. But Joe Biden and they rubbing their hands like Birdman. They want them. That's more votes, more vote blue no matter who. But that's more crime, more poverty, more BS. And we can't allow this to happen.
Getting in on the action right now, pushing for a civil war. Journalist Anya Parampil from the Gray Zone just posted this on X a short time ago. I'll read it here. Quote, with zero knowledge of Venezuela, ex-influencers and MAGA conservatives are cheering on criminal gangs pushing for civil war in the country. Make no mistake, this is where their regime change fantasy will lead.
And this was so crazy. Just listen, even Fox News, that's why we the real conservatives. Good criminals in Venezuela trying to overthrow the government. Bad Venezuelan criminals here. What you mean? You see them, they're the same group doing the same shit. Well, it's good when they do it to Maduro. It's bad when they do it here. No, it's bad when you do any of that shit anywhere. But the U.S. is getting exposed, though.
Do people understand how disastrous this will be for Venezuela, the region, and the United States? Your leaders intentionally flooded your nation with desperate migrants before, and they're preparing to do it again. They want blood in Venezuela. Anya knows more about Venezuela than just about anyone in Western journalism. Her book is called Corporate Coup, the failed attempt to overthrow Venezuelan democracy, and specifically looked at the Trump administration's attempts at a coup. Now the Biden administration getting in on the action. Anya joined.
Trump is full of shit for letting them manipulate him into going along with their bullshit. He didn't have no business talking about, we're gonna get the oil. You're not gonna get none of that oil. They played him, then he gave up the game. I don't know. He probably did that shit on purpose. I hope he did that shit on purpose. It was a 4D chess. But you never heard no U.S. official so openly brag about we're gonna take their oil. Until Trump said it, like he said in Syria, we took the oil. They're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to say we bringing them democracy. We want freedom over there. Trump like, oh, that's bullshit. I ain't got time for none of that. Trump said we taking their oil, which is imperialism. We don't like that, but that's why they don't want him in there, because he's telling the truth about their goddamn plans on seizing the Venezuela oil. Remember, they got the largest oil reserve on the planet. They're supposed to be living like the Saudis, but the U.S. imperialists, they can't have that.
Joins us now from the Gray Zone. Anya, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here.
My pleasure to be here, Clayton.
So you've been busy over the past 48 hours with all of what's descending into chaos in Venezuela. You know, a lot of people feel like are being played like a fiddle right now if they're watching corporate media. I, too, have seen like a lot of conservatives on social media posting about Venezuela, and they clearly are either being played or they're being willfully ignorant about what's going on here. What is your assessment of it?
Imperialists.
I think we have various competing interests here. I think, you know, I've been a fan of Elon Musk and his way of operating X up to this point. I do genuinely feel that it's been a better platform for free speech, and that the war in Gaza would not have been the same. We would have not seen it the same way in the West if not for what he allowed on X. That doesn't mean that he himself is perfect. And in this particular instance, he's decided to openly side with Maria Corina Machado, a figure that has received U.S. funding since the early 2000s, since 2002, 2003, when Chavez first took power, she was one of the leading so-called civil society activists, receiving State Department funding in order to overthrow Chavismo and the Venezuelan government. She's still around in 2024, but she wasn't on the ballot this time. She was basically the muscle behind the campaign of Edmundo Gonzalez, who was a former functionary in the pre-revolution days of Venezuela. He worked in El Salvador and Venezuela's ministry there when the United States was partnering with Venezuela to run a dirty war in El Salvador and neighboring Nicaragua. So I'm willing to bet he worked closely with Trump Venezuela envoy Elliot Abrams, who was later convicted for his role of criminality in the region over Iran-Contra, and is still advising the Biden administration today on Latin America. That's the candidate you have that Elon has thrown his weight behind, because for some reason in Latin America, and I'm guessing it has to do with natural resource wealth, he has decided to side with Javier Milei, a figure in Argentina that is very pro-United States.
Elon is an imperialist. He want to side with whoever will let him steal the resources so he can run his cause. They see all of. I told y'all the problem that the imperialists have is the revolutionary nations have all the resources. I keep telling y'all that. That's the problem they ran into. No, nothing is free anymore. Putin and all these people. So you don't have to take it. You have to go to big time war for it. You see, these just trying to put puppets in power. That's not gonna work anymore. They're not. It ain't no more. Nobody's voting for them, but they want the resources in Venezuela.
Pro-IMF. He's sometimes labeled as a libertarian, but I don't think any libertarian Argentine would be pegging their currency to the US dollar and being so dependent on foreign banksters in order to fund their economy. And that is basically the program that Elon and others would like to see rolled out in Venezuela under Edmundo Gonzalez. And that was the program in Venezuela before Chavez, all throughout Venezuela's history since the discovery of oil there in the 1920s. And then on the US political side, the MAGA conservatives, that I give them credit, being very brave on Ukraine and standing up to US intervention in Europe. Unfortunately, I feel they're beholden to a foreign lobby here in the United States, just as we have the Israel lobby, which is, reigns supreme. We also have a very
revolutionary salute to Toolbox Evolution for the $10 donation to the War Chest Revolution as Way of Life. I appreciate the donation, family. Revolutionary salute. Peace day, payday today. I appreciate your love and support.
Powerful expat community of Venezuelans and Cubans in Florida, which is a state that any U.S. presidential candidate seeks to win, and they play outsized influence here. They would like to use U.S. taxpayer money, and if it came down to it, U.S. troops in blood to return themselves to power in Venezuela. And unfortunately, too many U.S. political figures, even those that claim to put America first, fall for this line because they hear the word socialism and pretty much fall apart.
That's right. So over the past few days, all we've been hearing from these voices is it's a socialist country. And clearly there are problems with this election, and America needs to stand for the people of Venezuela. And they do not want to have a socialist government in charge. And we need to stand with the people who are taking to the streets. But it's clearly they're clearly conflating two things here, and it seems like they're fabricating an entire story in order to carry out their narrative. Are they not?
There are a couple points to look at here. First of all, I see a lot of people online pointing to a last-minute jump in support for Maduro that came in with the polls and comparing it to what happened in the United States during Stop the Steal, when there was like a 3-day pause in counting, and suddenly, I went to bed on election night in 2020 thinking that Trump had won re-election, and then 3 days later the result changed. That is not what happened in Venezuela. And first of all, because their elections are much easier to audit. You need an electric fingerprint scan and a physical ID in order to activate your ballot in Venezuela. You are then
Imagine that.
I know, right? And they're actually proud of that when I go to Venezuela. They're proud that they have voter ID laws, that they say that makes their country safer, more secure. But for some reason, people here can't get them, according to Democrats.
Right.
So you have that, and then you get a physical receipt of your ballot, which you carry into an on-site secure box, sign your name again to affirm that you oversaw that ballot drop-off. That physical ballot receipt, 54% of those ballots are automatically audited against the electric result tally in these polling sites after the vote is counted, in order to assuage fears that the digital or electronic vote was tampered with. And so the opposition claims that they won some of these polling sites that the government claimed Maduro won. The National Election Council should be able to put those rumors to bed by releasing the polling data, and we can get that anytime. We should be getting that anytime soon now. But the other point is, a few years ago, you may remember in Bolivia, that same line was rolled out, that there was a last-minute jump in support for Evo Morales, and that's why the election that he won in 2019, I believe, or 2020, I'm sorry, was fraudulent. But what we have to keep in mind about countries like Venezuela and Bolivia is that they don't actually operate like the United States. They have extremely rural areas where in some cases the vote count does come in very late, and those happen to typically be bastions of support for the progressive or sovereign government.
Yes,
in
the
this
poor
case,
people.
Maduro, and in Bolivia's case, Evo Morales. And so at the time in Bolivia, the OAS and outside powers were able to use that last minute spike in voting in order to carry out a coup. And that was later, even the New York Times admitted that no, that polling data was correct. It just had to do with votes coming in late. That could be the case coming here in Venezuela. But even if we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty discussion of vote and who won the election, the reality is that right now there are armed gangs shutting down streets in Venezuela, firing at troops. Okay, at least 20 Venezuelan soldiers have been injured in the past 24 hours because armed gangs are roaming the streets attempting to overthrow the government. Okay, this is what the U.S., the Democratic Party, freaked out about on January.
Brothers and their cousins is over here with armed gangs robbing, raping, pillaging, plundering. Right now, the Venezuelans, and you've been shooting police officers, stealing police cars. These look like New York right here. This could be Chicago. Look what the fuck the Democrats done did. Now, guess what? Now, Maduro, he finna deal with these people, chase them out of his country, and they're on their way to the U.S. You can be for sure of that.
January 6th, when they had a shaman walking through the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., and acted like that was a violent insurrection to overthrow the U.S. government, when the police were there pretty much opening the doors for protesters to go inside. That is not what is happening in Venezuela. Can you imagine if MAGA had armed themselves, had shot U.S. troops, National Guard troops, and police?
See, I told you. They saying it's bad. They saying it's bad for Venezuelans or America for January 6th. That's bad. You lost the election. Give up. But in Venezuela, you could shoot at the police, shoot at army officials, block roads, rape, pillage, plunder, and that's called democracy. See, people are getting tired of that nonsense that the U.S. is doing, and ain't nobody going for this BS. Venezuela is too strong of a military. They got military might. None of these phony revolutionaries will ever overthrow the government. They just gonna get themselves killed. A bunch of them gonna get locked up. The rest of them gonna get ran out of the country, and they're gonna be on their way to America to commit crimes.
And put up barricades in the street around the White House to violently force the overthrow of the sitting government. That I don't even want to know what would happen in the U.S. if that took place. And so the fact that that's happening in Venezuela right now, and that's what you have people cheering on, is very concerning, because the military has faced many tests of its loyalty to Maduro over the past decade, and they've never switched, even when the U.S. military was on the Colombian border threatening to invade. So I highly doubt
they done tried to. Yeah, the U.S. military done pretend like they were going to invade. Man, please, the Russians done trained them, equipped them. Remember, the Russian Navy just left, giving them some good anti-ship missiles and stuff like that, just in case the U.S. won't try to sell their warships around there. That you will be in big trouble. They got air defense system, advanced air defense systems. You're not gonna be flying. U.S. military won't be flying over Venezuela, bombing them. So the best they can do is try to have a civil war. They need the military to split from Maduro, which they're not gonna do. They revolutionaries. They still in the bloodline of Chavez. You know, because the kids like Gaddafi, they take care of the poor. See, the poor is going to always ride for Maduro because he's looking out for them. No, he's pulling them up, and that's what the U.S. don't like, and that's what the bougie elitists in Venezuela, they don't like. They want to sell the poor out and bring in Americans to steal everything so they can get richer. But the problem is revolutionaries is in power in Venezuela, and they're not going out without a hell of a fight. And guess what? Russia will never let Venezuela, China will never let Maduro be overthrown. They got too much invested into this man and this government.
The Venezuelan military is going to throw their weight behind these opposition figures now. And so if this violence escalates, what we're looking at is a civil war in our hemisphere. We're complaining about Venezuelan migrants now in the United States. How do we think it's going to look if there's a civil war in that country?
Right. Destabilizing countries is the number one cause. When people want to complain about illegal immigrants in the United States, they never talk about the cause of it. They talk about the symptoms, right? So we go in and destabilize these Latin American countries, and then these flood of immigrants pour into the United States, and we complain about it. If you look where it starts, it's starting right here with this U.S.-backed color revolution happening in Venezuela. I guess I'll get you out of here on this, which is, you kind of touched on the oil point of this earlier, but when people say, well, why would the U.S. government want to do this? Why would they want to overthrow Maduro? They're using the socialist argument, but you mentioned oil at the heart of it. Is that what we're really looking at here, is oil and resources, the overthrowing of this government so that the United States can control its oil resources?
Yeah, that's a very key point here. When we talk about socialism, Venezuela's economy, and this is something I emphasize in the book, is vastly controlled by the private sector. Its government and the public sector are only responsible for controlling about 15 to 20% of the economy. That's not so different, actually, from statistics here in the United States. The difference is what's privatized, what's socialized in Venezuela are their oil reserves, are there gold deposits, are there vast mineral reserves. And what we're talking about here are oil reserves over double the amount that Saudi Arabia has. Venezuela has by far the largest oil reserves in the world.
Double of Saudi Arabia. So I just want you to, with your mind, think about the wealth of the Saudis. Venezuela probably 2 times as rich. The only reason they not is because the white supremacists, the colonizer, want to bring them to their knees. But they want the world. They want the world to think. See, it's the socialist policies that got the shelves empty, got people coming across the border. They fooling people. No, that's a goddamn lie. You are doing that to people. See, the reason Libya is poor because it was the policies of Gaddafi. Goddamn lie. Reason Libya is poor because you killed Gaddafi and you fucked up the good policies of the revolutionary Gaddafi.
And the largest untapped gold deposits in the world. So let's think about that. The world is changing. Russia, China, the BRICS nations are establishing a world, a financial system that is going to be less dependent on the US dollar. That's already very clear. And I'm willing to bet gold is going to play a role in that future economy. So Venezuela, I believe, will probably be invited to join BRICS this year in Russia. And the United States would much rather that gold and that oil be under the command of not Venezuelan companies doing business with U.S. companies, but U.S. companies, period. And that's the difference here. Venezuela, before the revolution, was a free-for-all for the foreign corporate U.S. and European companies to exploit the oil and all of the reserves. The IMF came there and dictated their domestic policy, didn't allow them to develop a national industry capacity. So they were very heavily dependent on oil or imports for basic goods and exporting their oil. Well, Venezuela's tried to reverse that, tried to develop their own ability to build their own products, not be so dependent on imports, but that takes time. In the meantime, the U.S. has imposed these sanctions and attempted to strangle their economy because they're so dependent on these imports, but it's not working. Russia and these other countries.
Never forget, Venezuela just sent, I showed y'all that, 3 days ago, sent soldiers to Burkina Faso, salute family, sent soldiers to the revolutionary nations in Africa to make sure they can't be overthrown. Ain't nothing gonna happen in Venezuela. Please, the revolutionaries right on time. Don't make North Korea show up over here. That's over with. Imperialist. Your wet dream of robbing and pillaging is over. You're done. Now, you can go on TV. They can scare all Americans half to death, propagandize them, but they're going to have to fight. You got to fight, U.S. You got to fight them Houthis. You got to fight China. You got to fight Russia, man. Can't be hiding behind Ukraine. You got to fight Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. You got to fight them. Now, Cuba, Venezuela. You have to fight these people, man. These people not listening to you. They're not putting puppets in power no more. That's over with.
Countries have stepped in to support Venezuela. They were able to survive, even able to possibly, Maduro, according to polls, did even before the vote took place, have a good chance at winning this election. I don't think Americans in Washington, the people running the policy here, can really wrap their heads around the fact that he's managed to survive. And because they thought the Guaido coup or any just little push that they give would result in the collapse of his government. And the fact that it stayed this long tells me that it comes down to the military. And I don't think we want to fight a war against the Venezuelan military, not a dirty war, not a direct war. The Russian military is present in Venezuela. They have advisors. They care about their ally there. They're not going to let it go. So I would hate for World War III to come to the U.S. continent, or to the American continent, rather.
This is what Putin wants.
Yeah, and
see, I hate to say it. Putin wants it. Putin might push for this. He might push for the U.S. to get a taste of their medicine, and they have to have a big fight with Venezuela. And Maduro will be down with that. Well, oh, hell yeah. Maduro will be down with that. Why? They're already suffering. They're already going through hell. If you're already in hell, you can't go no lower. So they might as well bring the United States to hell with them. You see, the United States is playing a dirty game. Militarily, they cannot defeat Venezuela. Please, how? You think Hamas got some underground bunkers? Venezuela got deep underground bunkers. You see, so just defeat, you can't ride over nations just bombing to death no more. You have to put your soldiers on the ground. You got to get belly to belly with them. You want to win a motherfucking war. So the U.S., all this wolfing and bluffing, that's over with. That's over with. You won't fight Venezuela, they won't fight you too.
Putin of Russia just congratulated Nicolas Maduro on an election victory, so that I'm sure sits well with Anthony Blinken and the Biden administration, whoever is running the Biden administration at this point. Anya Powerpill is the author of the book, a couple books on Venezuela, Corporate Coup, The Failed Attempt to Overthrow Venezuelan Democracy. Everyone should go check out that book if you want to educate yourself on Venezuela. And to all of those...
Oh, man, these people just tried to overthrow Putin, man. Remember they said Putin election wasn't fair. Come on, man. They say Putin election wasn't fair. They say the Russians. They say the Russians wanted the white supremacist Navalny. Come on, man. These people should be ashamed of their goddamn self. But they not. They don't have no shame. But let's back up for a second. Because we're gonna get that Venezuela story is the top story. We're gonna get deeper into that. But let's back up. And let's go look at the Civil War. Revolutionary salute, family. Appreciate you subbing. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You family now. Let's take a look at the Civil War that's brewing in Israel. Now, you're not going to see CNN and MSNBC or Fox News really talking about this story, because when I seen this story, I said, you got to be kidding me. How could I have missed that? I'm so busy. But we were going to talk about this today. We're talking about Israelis storming the prisons and storming the military bases to free soldiers who have been arrested for sexually assaulting, the R word, we ain't gonna use that here, the R word, Palestinian prisoners. They've been the R word, these Palestinian prisoners. So it was so bad, they had to arrest some of them. And guess what? Those lunatics say, hell no, you will not be arresting our people. They got the right to R-word these Palestinians.
The Israeli army says that it hit 10 Hezbollah targets in 7 different areas of southern Lebanon. A war monitor says Israeli missiles also struck 2 air defense bases in southern Syria overnight. This is in response to the weekend bombing of a soccer field in the Golan Heights. It killed 12 children.
That's a false flag.
The missile strike overnight happened in the province of Dara. No casualties were reported, but this comes as fears are growing over a potential all-out war at Israel's northern border. The CBS News foreign correspondent Deborah Pata joining us now with the latest on the war. Deborah, good morning.
Suspected of raping and abusing. Monday, right-wing Israeli nationalists stormed 2 military facilities protesting the arrest of 9 Israel Defense Force reservists suspected of raping and abusing a Palestinian prisoner whose injuries were so bad he had to be hospitalized. In this social media footage, you see IDF guards contesting the arrest. The abused prisoner was a Hamas operative being held at the Sderteiman detention facility near Beersheba, where many Palestinians...
Oh, they saying they got the right to R-word Hamas prisoners. What are you talking about? That's like the U.S. saying we got the right to R-word Al-Qaeda when we get them. I can sexually abuse Al-Qaeda. Like, what the hell are you talking about, psychopath? No, you can't. What the hell? But that's what they saying. We get to sexually assault them. They belong to us now. And what though? They just say Hamas like people give a damn. We don't give a damn what you call them people. You can't be sexually assaulting these people. But guess what? Children and all, y'all.
Arrested from Gaza after October 7 are detained. The soldiers have been held for questioning over the alleged abuse, a rare occurrence in Israel, especially.
If the Israeli army arrested 9 motherfuckers, you know this shit was bad. You know this was horrible. It was systematic. They probably sexually assaulted everything came in there. For them to do this and put this stigma on them, but this should be all over the motherfucking news. This is what they said Hamas was doing, but it's them.
During wartime, furious right-wingers attempted to storm the facility. One protester said, if they touch our shoulders, we will rise up against the government. In this social media footage, you see a group of right-wing protesters.
Revolutionary salute, Queens. Revolutionary salute to Shana G for the donation to the war chest, the $5 donation. Revolution is the way of life. Absolutely appreciate the donation. Finally salute. That a pound? That a $5 pound? Okay, that's some foreign money. We need that too.
Protesters clashing with police outside another army base and trying to break into a nearby military court compound.
Y'all think this is a game? Y'all think this is a game? These people fighting the police, fighting, and this is all about they want their soldiers back. No, they got the right to do that. They can sexually assault whoever they want. Whoa. This is the democracy they've been telling us about. This is the most moral army in the world they've been telling us about. I told y'all, they done built the Frankenstein that's out of control. They cannot control these people over here. They cannot control it over there, I mean.
Today, a member of the Likud party justified the rape and abuse of Palestinian prisoners, yelling, everything is legitimate. The 9 Israeli soldiers were...
You heard him? A member of the Knesset, that's like a member of Congress or Senate saying, all of the R-word is legitimate. And then they go find some demonic Talmudic scriptures. See, they are gone. They are nothing but gone to us. We can abuse them. And as long as we admit we are abusing them, it is the right thing to do. See, this is sick. And they so power hungry and lustful. They feel like U.S. and Europe is bowing to them and they will do whatever they want.
This will appear before a military court today. Israelis have been rattled by the events which expose the deep internal divisions in this country.
War. That's called a civil war. See, when you talk about the deep internal, ma'am, do you mean a civil war? And why ain't y'all letting the whole world know a civil war is brewing in Israel? Let's get deep into that. Because you see, the news, they didn't really tell y'all what happened. I got a few more clips from different people that's gonna get into the torture that was going on in there, the disgusting torture. And when you see the Society of Israel say, oh, hell no, we don't care what our soldiers did. They can sexually abuse those Palestinians. Give us our soldiers back. They trying to overthrow the government because they want to be able to do whatever they want to whoever they want to do it to.
Israeli citizens are rioting in the streets in support of the right to rape Palestinians, while Israeli politicians are debating the right to rape Palestinians. Now, you might think this must be hyperbole, that I must be exaggerating. This simply cannot be happening. That's been distorted, taken out of context. This is exactly what's happening. Let's just be clear about that. In a society...
I couldn't believe it. I'm like, hold on. What is this CNN, this Saturday Night Live, I mean? What is this, a skit? This can't be real. This cannot be real. People saying, we can really do this. Oh, these people done really lost their mind on TV. And the news really want to hide this. But it's spilling over. So CBS and some of those people had to do something on it. But if this was Hamas, it would be every station all day, the systematic abuse of the prisoners. No, it's Israel who has systematically raped, all words, because I want to shut my live down, these Palestinians.
In which genocidal mania is spinning out of control. Now, there have been repeated multiple reports of Palestinian women and men being raped and sexually abused and systematically tortured by the Israeli state for months. And I must make it clear, long before the 7th of October. Now, you may recall that in May, the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor issued requests for arrest warrants for war crimes and crimes against humanity against both Hamas and Israeli leaders. But whilst those requests for arrest warrants specify torture in the case of Hamas, they did not do so in the case of the Israeli state, not yet anyway, despite an abundance of evidence. Now, the International Criminal Court issues requests for arrest warrants if it does not believe the judicial system of a state is capable of taking action itself. This is the principle of complementarity outlined by Parliamentarians for Global Action as follows. The ICC may only exercise jurisdiction when national legal systems fail to do so, when it is demonstrated that they are unwilling or unable to genuinely carry out proceedings. This may explain why, after months of reports of torture and rape, Israeli military police today sought to arrest 9 Israeli soldiers in the Stay Taiman facility, which is described by a lawyer in an interview with the Israeli magazine Plus 972 magazine last month as more horrific than Abu Ghraib. Now, before I just say more about that interview, the point is this. They know that there is overwhelming evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that the initial request details some crimes, but not many crimes. It doesn't even go into, for example, the bombing campaign in Gaza. It focuses primarily on starvation, on the depriving of necessities of life from a civilian population. So clearly this is an attempt to forestall that. Now, there was a history of, within Israel, of very few soldiers being held accountable, that even when you have examples of soldiers being tried, that either they have no punishment or just a minimal punishment, which is in no way proportionate to the crime. So bear that in mind. Now, the interview in Plus 972 magazine included testimonies of Palestinians being raped with a stick in front of the detainees, backing up similar testimonies published in CNN and the New York Times. No. The interview also detailed other reports of a Palestinian prisoner declaring he had personally witnessed multiple rapes and cases in which Israeli soldiers made dogs sexually assault prisoners. And I'm sorry.
Now, that's disgusting. Do you hear that? That's disgusting. Like I say, we're going to get past all that disgusting stuff, but the news not going to tell you that they made dogs rape those Palestinians. Dang it, all word. I don't want them to take the lie. They made dogs sexually abuse the Palestinians. Shame on the news for not saying that, but it's the evidence is there. I told you it was so disgusting what they were doing that they had to arrest 9 of them. They're like, oh man, goddamn, y'all gonna bring us all down. Come on now, what's wrong with y'all? And y'all recorded it? Oh man, TikTok. Oh, goddamn, y'all got to go down now, please, to save us all. Even dogs, they allow dogs to brutalize these precious babies, because it was babies too. They want to make out they were just grown men. That's all nonsense. Kids, teenagers, men and women too, but teenagers and children as well.
Sorry for having to go through these details. There are now endless reports of Palestinian prisoners.
What they don't want to tell you is these the people Hamas said they want back. These people is Hamas saying we want to trade your people for our people, and that's what the fuck the news is trying to hide. The Palestinian people that are hostages. They're not arrested. They're hostages. There's no court dates. Teenagers picked up, you throw a stone, your ass in there getting sexually brutalized, and your court date might be 5 years from now. And you with these sick perverts. It's just crazy, man.
Prisoners being tortured to death by the Israeli captors, while others have had their limbs amputated because of them being restrained for so long during the ordeal. All the evidence suggests that torture has been used on an industrial scale against those detained by the Israeli state, many of them not charged with anything and not guilty of anything other than being a Palestinian, as we'll discuss. Now, according to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz,
I didn't hear about the Nazis sexually assaulted the Jews with dogs. Did y'all? I didn't hear that part, because that might have happened. So I'm not Holocaust denying YouTube community guidelines. But we do have evidence of the imposters that's going by Israelis over there of them brutalizing Palestinians, sexually abusing them. Now, I ain't gonna say brutalize because you would think bite. No, sexually assaulting them using dogs as well.
The Israeli military police raided Stertheimen. The soldiers mutinied, reportedly spraying pepper spray at the military personnel arriving to detain the Israeli suspects. The Palestinian detainee was reportedly taken to hospital with severe injuries to what is described in Haaretz as an intimate body part, with injuries leaving him unable
this how you
to
keep
walk.
This war going. You do this to people, you think they won't be your friend?
Then Israeli citizens and Israeli politicians, including ministers, marched on the base and rioted in support of the soldiers. Prem Thacker, reporter with Zetio, was there on the scene and recorded some of what happened.
Look at this, bro. Look at this. Why CNN ain't showing this? Why CNN ain't showing this? Why MSNBC? They want to. I told y'all right now they are focusing. Kamala. That's why I ain't bringing it. I had a whole P Diddy charge for P Diddy on the investigation for the POC thing. I'll bring that tomorrow. I said no. That's their election of my duty as a revolutionary. If I don't bring y'all all of this. This is what they hide from y'all. These people done attacked a military base, man. Women, kids, who freed the war to the sexually abused people with dogs and shit. This is how sick. Then they want to say, so the news media, they say, oh, right-wing Israelis. Man, please, I don't know what wing of them is. I just know they're Israelis. See how they do that? No, Israelis did it. I don't know if they're right wing, left wing, if they neutral. I know they said they want their soldiers out. They don't care what they do to Palestinians. CNN trying to find some time, look this story and put something together before they show this to the.
When the soldiers were taken to a military court, violent mobs charged it in an effort to free the detained soldiers. Let's see.
Man. Come on, man. They're supposed to be shooting them, beating them. Come on, man. The people storming military bases. You know what they used to do? Storm the police department and then drag our people out and string your ass up. That used to happen to our people. The secret relationship between blacks and Jews. You see, a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people, ancestors was in on that slave trade, but they was right there in the crowd at the time. They was the sheriffs at the time. They was the antagonizers at the time. They was the money men. Oh, yeah. The hillbillies, they always was flunkies and suckers and got played by the money men. That's why they so hot at the money men, because they got played and got nothing. They got nothing for enslaving us the whole time. They got played too. That's real fucking talk. But anyway, see, they used to, I said, I don't like this. My spirit is bubbling to see people outside police departments yelling, hollering, screaming. Some of the last thing our ancestors heard was mobs like this. Before they got strung up.
Armed militias have claimed they've taken over military courts.
Man, they said they took over the court, man. Look at this shit. Come on, man. So this is democracy. Democracy? Is this democracy? See, the January 6th people, and I'm not one who talk about that January 6th FBI op they did on them goddamn people. They fell for that government trap, and now look how they did and arrested all them people. But anyway, because they got too, but it's a known experiment. If you get people in large crowds like this, all it takes is a little energy to get to going. Naturally, people just get hype, and then you move with the crowd and you do bullshit you normally would not do. That's what happened to January 6th. But that was called a coup on democracy. Many people had to go to court. The Democrats were screaming, lock them up. They tried to overthrow. I want to hear the Democrats come out and say all of these people tried to overthrow democracy. This is a democracy, right? I want to hear the U.S. government tell me all of these people who overran military bases, they done seized a military court, talking about they the rulers now. Come on now. I can't wait to hear what they got to say about this. They crickets because they want to find out how can they just was too patriotic and they just got ahead of themselves. Nobody was hurt except the Palestinians who were sexually abused by dogs and shit.
Now, as Prem Thacker notes, Israeli forces have routinely used fists, tear gas, snipers, and tanks against Palestinians existing. Mobs attacking a military court to protest holding soldiers accountable for sexual abuse are met with man-to-man pleas to calm down and shoves. Meanwhile, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, has debated whether it's acceptable to rape prisoners. This is not a sick joke. It's exactly what happened. Let's listen with subtitles provided by the anonymous and brilliant Israeli peace activist who goes by the to the point handle at I really hate you.
אני לא יודע אם יודעים, אבל יש אירוע כרגע בשדה תימן שמשטרה צבאית הגיעו לעצור חיילים ששמרו על מחבלי נוח'בה. והחיילים בשדה תימן, מתקן מעצר של מחבלי נוח'בה, ומשטרה צבאית שם הגיעה לעצור כמה לוחמים שם שכנראה בגלל איזה שהם טענות של יחס למחבלי נוח'בה, ויש שם אירוע של התבצרות וכולי. הטרלול שהמדינה שלנו נכנסת אליו סביב הסיפור הזה הוא מטורף, וצריך להפסיק אותו, ואני חושב שצריך פה לתת דוגמה אישית, ואני אומר עכשיו, ואני קורא לחברי הקואליציה לעשות כמוני, אני קם, ואני יוצא מפה, ואני לא הולך להצביע יותר על שום דבר, עד שהסיפור הזה והטרלול הזה, שיש מי שבפרקליטות חושב, שאפשר לבוא ולעצור חיילים על דברים שעושים למחבלי נוח'בה, לא נגמר. אוקיי? ואני מאוד מבקש, ואני חושב שחבריי בקואליציה טוב יעשו, אם יעשו כמוני. אנחנו לא יכולים להמשיך כרגיל.
להכניס מקל לרקטום של בן אדם, זה לגיטימי?
כן, אם הוא נוח'בה, הכל לגיטימי לעשות לו.
אוקיי.
הכל. הכל. זה מה שהכל, האנשים האלה, אתה יודע מה עשו?
אוקיי.
טוב.
יש דברים שלא עושים.
So when the Palestinian politician Ahmed Tibi asks to insert a stick in a person's rectum is what is legitimate, Hanak Milfizki from Likud, the ruling party, to which, of course, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself belongs and is Prime Minister of, angrily yells back, yes, if he is a Nukba, everything is legitimate to do to him. A Nukba being a Hamas militant. Now, the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, published a video message demanding Israel's military advocate general takes her hands off what he calls Israel's heroic warriors. The national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, announced the arrests were nothing less than shameful, adding that the defense minister, IDF chief, and the military authorities need to back the fighters and learn from the prison service. And that's, by the way, it should be clear, he heads it, adding light treatment of terrorists is over. Soldiers, he says, need to have our full support. The Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, said he was shocked to see harsh pictures of soldiers being arrested, and that was impossible to accept this treatment. I mean, just listen to this. Do you really think this is a state which is in any way capable of trying these people? Now, let's be clear. We're talking about rape here. We're about using rape to torture prisoners. Bear in mind, many of these prisoners haven't even been charged with anything. Now, the estimate offered by a Palestinian prisoners' rights organization is that there were 3,380 Palestinian prisoners held as administrative detainees. That's charged without charge or trial. But crucially, that excludes those from Gaza. We have absolutely no idea how many people from Gaza are being detained without charge. But we can imagine, based on those existing statistics excluding Gaza, that is a huge number, given, of course, that's where the military operation is focused. We know that hundreds of Palestinian kids have been detained and that charities warn they're being starved and having their bones broken in detention. Now, in this case, 4 of the soldiers accused of raping this Palestinian man are being represented by a legal aid organization named Honenu. And guess what the defense they're using is? Self-defense. Now, let's listen to this from Erez Tadmor, the speechwriter, former speechwriter Benjamin Netanyahu.
קודם כל, אנחנו לא יודעים מה קרה או לא קרה במקרה הזה. אני לא הייתי מוציא מכלל אפשרות את זה שהמחבלים פגעו אחד בשני ועשו אחד לשני את המעשים המטונפים שהם רגילים או חינכו אותם לבצע.
That's right. He claimed Palestinian detainees raped themselves. Now, a few things. Firstly, there's a long history involving the Israeli state and rape and sexual abuse. Hedi Viterbo, a senior lecturer in law at Queen Mary University of London, writes a detailed Twitter thread about this history, including reports of the rape of Palestinians during the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe, which accompanied the foundation of Israel, of reports in 2010 of the Israeli state sexually assaulting Palestinian children, and indeed Save the Children in 2023 found Palestinian child detainees were being sexually abused in Israeli military detention. But let me read out, too, this post from an Israeli analyst named Shail Ben Ephraim. He says, I feel stupid and ashamed. In May, an expose came out in CNN detailing the abuses in Stay Timon. Then the New York Times released their own article on it. Both were backed up with Israeli sources, crossed with Palestinian ones. I dismissed them because my government sources and Israeli media denied them. My whole life I was told that the Israeli media was out to get Israel, that they were all anti-Semites. But today I realized how much I was lied to by my country, by my friends, by my media. Today, many of the people I talked to who denied these allegations admitted they were true. And the worst part, none of this is coming to light because the IDF and government have changed their hearts about it. It's coming out because of because the pressure from the UK, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice was getting too great to ignore. This would get Netanyahu, Gallant, and the chief of staff in serious trouble. So they finally said the truth, that Israel is routinely torturing inmates, that sexual abuse is fairly common there, that people have been tortured to death. Worst of all, many of the people in this facility were innocent, rounded up by accident, but there was no real verification process before they were subjected to this hell on earth. This can't go on, as he concludes there. Well, firstly, it's welcome that he is confirming the truth, that the Israeli state is systematically torturing and indeed raping detainees, many of whom are guilty of nothing other than being Palestinian civilians, arbitrarily abducted by Israeli soldiers, in other words, hostages. It's also important to note that international pressure, too limited, but what limited pressure exists is having an impact. And that pressure is in part coming about because of the work of not least Palestinian journalists who have risked their lives in the biggest slaughter of journalists ever recorded in any conflict to show the world the truth about what is happening to the Palestinian people, and also those who've been protesting and organizing in countries, for example, like Britain, which is putting pressure on governments. But proper penitence would involve making amends for his own contribution in creating the culture which allowed the systematic violation of basic human rights. Last December, this analyst posted a picture of Palestinian detainees in Gaza stripped naked, except for their underwear, declaring that humiliating Hamas in an honor society weakens them. Well, how does he feel about that? How does he feel about flouting the Geneva Conventions now in order to defeat the enemy? The problem here is that Israel is a society in the grip of genocidal mania. It is unfortunately striking that after 10 months of barbarism, the one thing it took to get Israeli civilians to riot was support for raping Palestinians. Just imagine for a few seconds that Palestinians had been rioting in support of raping Israelis. Just imagine that for a minute. Imagine the headlines. Imagine how that'd be served up about what this tells us about the Palestinian people in general. The allegations of rape during the 7th of October attacks were specifically offered up in support of committing genocide, of a genocidal onslaught against Gaza on the basis they showed the collective depravity of people who live there. So what now, eh? What now? The truth is, Israel is in the midst of genocidal mania. That's what we're discussing here. There are courageous voices within Israel, but they are so courageous precisely because they are so isolated. This horror will not end without external action. Israel has to be completely isolated internationally, turn into a pariah state like apartheid South Africa before it, with an arms embargo, comprehensive sanctions, and boycotts. Otherwise, Israeli society will only sink further into an abyss of genocidal depravity. Things are dark now. Oh, my word, they can get even darker. We are looking at the consequences of impunity, of how genocidal mania takes a life of its own. It just gets worse and worse. A positive feedback loop. Nothing is stopping it. This is where total dehumanization gets you. And that's why pressure has to come from abroad, because those courageous and isolated individuals in Israel are never going to be able to stop the level of depravity that you have just listened to and heard with your own ears and seen with your own eyes. Please like and
Wild scenes coming out of Israel yesterday when members of the Knesset and government ministers joined a far-right armed mob to storm multiple Israeli military bases. And so as I said before, you may think this is an exaggeration, but it was literally in defense of IDF soldiers who gang raped a Palestinian prisoner. So let me back up. Let me show you some of the images here as I speak. This is one of the mobs storming a military base that has been turned into a mass prison camp. Now, this is a place that has become quite notorious post-October 7th. There have been multiple news reports and a UN investigation that revealed horrifying details of systematic abuse of the Palestinians who are being held there, including systematic sexual assault. Specifically, we've got multiple accounts of a hot metal rod being shoved in the anus of multiple Palestinian prisoners. We've also heard about severe beatings. There have been dozens of Palestinians who have died at these facilities. Starvation, I mean, every kind of degradation and torture you can imagine has been documented by Palestinians, doctors, Israeli doctors, whistleblowers, journalists, and the like occurring at this location. So the Israeli government has been under a lot of pressure from the ICC, the ICJ, and also from some different world governments, including the UK, to show some sort of willingness to prosecute their own people for these crimes. So they decided to go ahead with the prosecution of, I believe, 9 IDF reservists who they claim they have overwhelming evidence participated in one of these sexual assaults of a Palestinian prisoner. So yesterday, when the military police go to arrest and detain these IDF soldiers, it kicks off this absolute riot, first at the location where the abuse occurred, then at the other military base where the reservists were brought and detained and held awaiting trial. Just absolute insane scenes that are unfolding. So in order to understand this a little bit better with regards to Israeli domestic political context, we wanted to bring in a guest. We've got an Israeli journalist who's set to join us, so let's get to that. Happy to be joined this morning by Shael Ben Ephraim. He is the host of multiple shows, one on YouTube called Shael Ben Ephraim Explains Israel, and another one called the History of the Land of Israel podcast. Welcome, Shael.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, so I did my best to set up what unfolded in Israel yesterday with this mob storming multiple Israeli military bases. Let's actually put F2 up on the screen. This was, I think, some of the secondary clashes that broke out at the detention center where the Israeli reservists who are accused of sexual assault are being held. Could you help us just understand here, Shael, some of the context within which these clashes erupted?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult for Israel watchers to fully comprehend what's going on here too, but I'll do my best. So the best way to set the stage for this is to look at what's going on socially in Israel right now. So there's always been a pattern where when Israeli soldiers are accused of doing anything to Palestinians, a lot of elements in society rally behind them. It used to be the extreme right, and now it's spread. So there's always been this kind of impulse to defend Israeli soldiers. It used to be a minority position, but October 7th strengthened that trend a lot. So after October 7th, the Israeli soldiers were seen as heroes to a much greater degree than they ever had been before. And the events of October 7th made the Hamas members the worst enemies of the public in the state of Israel. And for many people, that even spread to other Palestinians, especially in Gaza, who they saw as supporting the events of October 7th. So you really had a increased amount of support for the IDF and a increased amount of hatred for Palestinians and Hamas in particular. That meant that there's a sort of culture of impunity to do whatever you want to Hamas because of what they did on October 7th. It strengthens existing trends and made them a lot stronger. And that's one of the reasons why when there have been various crimes committed or alleged crimes committed by IDF soldiers in Gaza, and also in Israel against detainees, the IDF has not prosecuted them or has very rarely prosecuted them. Now, it's important to note that the military brass and the IDF wants to. They want to prosecute people who do things like this, not because they're bleeding heart liberals or anything, but because the military has an impulse to keep discipline. Because without discipline, it's hard for them to function. But they know that if they prosecute people, they won't get the backing of the government, to put it mildly, and elements in the government will come out against them, attack them, try to get them fired. Protesters might try to harm their families. So the pressure from the extreme right is great. So that's why there hasn't been much discipline in the IDF, because no one wants to touch the rank and file soldiers. And of course, among the rank and file soldiers, there's a lot of right-wing extremists as well, but also just people who are very angry at the Palestinians for what happened on October 7th, and also just people who are not good people who want to do whatever they can, and now they can get away with it. Right? So there hasn't been much discipline.
Right, so let's put this up there on the screen. Just to Crystal laid out some of the details. Just 1 second, I want to get your reaction here. Where they're storming this detention center, and these lawmakers, as you're saying, are trying to inject chaos into the Israeli army. Can you just then outline the exact circumstances of what happened here and what it's like to witness it from inside of Israel?
Yeah. So what happened now is, because there's been massive pressure from abroad, most particularly investigations from the ICC and the ICJ, but also a demand from the British government, and to a lesser extent from the American government, to start cracking down on what's happening in this facility, in this detainee facility, which is known as Detaiman. So in May and in June, exposés came out about Detaiman on CNN and the New York Times, citing serious war crimes, torture, to the point where some detainees were getting killed from beatings that they had. Others were having limbs amputated because they were kept in positions where the blood wasn't circulating, and claims of sexual abuse. And Israel denied it, but the allegations weren't going away because they were true. As it turns out, they were true. So under immense international pressure, and when the British said they would stop selling arms to Israel, Israel finally decided to prosecute 9 soldiers who had been involved in a sexual assault on a detainee. This story came to light when doctors saw that one of the detainees had their anus had been something had been inserted in their anus very forcefully, and the injuries were very clearly indicative of sexual abuse. Once that news came out that they had been arrested, soldiers in their unit posted on social media about what was happening and said that this is an outrage. And within an hour, people showed up on the base. Protesters, family members, members of Knesset, the most extreme right-wing politicians like Gottlieb from the Likud and Tzvi Sukkot in Ben Gvir's party, and along with masked people in uniform, heavily armed. Eventually, the police managed to get them to leave. They convinced them to leave. The police, which is under Ben Gvir, who is the most extreme right-wing leader in Israel, convinced them to leave. Then after that, they assaulted the detention center where they were being held in Bet Lid, and went into the military courts. And again, the police didn't stop them because the police is under the extreme right wing. So what we have here is the Israeli security apparatus captured, or at least strongly hindered, by the most extreme right-wing elements in society. And it's important to note that leader, Ben Gvir, and people like him didn't go to the army. They're hated by the security services. They're considered
80, maybe 85 to 90% of the Israelis said that the military hadn't been hard enough on the Palestinians, that they got to take the gloves off. So never they want you to think, oh, this is a group of extremists. Are you damn? This is the country, is an extremist country.
Considered terrorists by a lot of people in the security services, but the security services are increasingly powerless to stop them. And this threatens the ability of Israel to operate as a sovereign state. And of course, also threatens Israel's standing in the world, and is an absolute nightmare for Israel from every perspective. And of course, it also shows that these elements in society are one of the reasons that this happened, because Ben Gvir is responsible for the prison services. So he's also responsible for oversight over this prison. And he's made it his populistic goal to show that under him, terrorists will have the worst possible conditions. And I don't know whether he ordered any of this or not, probably not, but he created a circumstance where being inhumane to detainees was expected. It was a good thing. And of course, we need to point out that a lot of these detainees were not members of Hamas. We don't know the exact number, it looks like the person who was abused in this case was a Hamas terrorist, but a lot of the people who experience these things are innocent. So this is a scandal that speaks to Israel's human rights. It speaks to Israel's ability to govern as a sovereign state, and so on.
Were any of the violent protesters yesterday arrested?
No. No one was arrested. They were convinced to go home. The police will not arrest them unless there's a political decision to do so. Because
so, Shyle, what does all of this mean for? I saw some speculation about, that you could have an even greater conflagration if there's a withdrawal from Gaza without whatever complete victory looks like, which, the complete victory that's been laid down of destroying Hamas is likely impossible to achieve. What do you expect this portends for the future of Israel when the viewpoints that are being expressed, as you lay out, were once fringe and are now completely mainstream to the point of, I could show the video, but I'll just paraphrase it. You're literally having a debate in the Knesset about whether it is legitimate to, quote, insert a stick in a person's rectum. And you have a member of the Likud party, a Knesset member, saying, yes, if he is a Nukba, a Hamas terrorist, everything is legitimate to do to him. That's how mainstream these views have become. So what does this portend for the future of Israel?
Well, unfortunately, the trend predates. It predates the war. The war has exacerbated it. And it's actually not that different from what we see in the United States or what we're seeing in other countries where the populist right wing is becoming increasingly powerful. They use a lot of the same methods that MAGA does here, that Le Pen does in France, but it's tied to a deep Jewish fundamentalist impulse that has always been in Israel, and it's frightening. What does it portend for the future? It's sort of hard to have a country that is secular, liberal, the way that Israel has been with its flaws, and that has this kind of impulse in its governance. The next elections will be a battle for the soul of Israel. And as we know from the United States, even when the more moderate side wins, the other side continues with disinformation and venom and trying to sabotage the ability of the government to rule. I think there's going to be a lot of people in Israel who, if this continues to be the kind of government that they have in the long term, will leave. And those will be the most productive members of society. Those will be the high-tech leaders. Those will be the professors. Those will be the literati and so on and so forth, which is something that I think the extreme right in Israel wants, because that will help them run the country better. And there's an attempt to dismantle the Israeli judicial system, because that's the one check and balance the Israeli system has against this kind of power. So right now, Israel, similar to a lot of other countries in the West, or the United States as an example, is having a battle for its soul. And I think if the liberal democratic forces in Israel lose, Israel will be lost. It's not going to be able to survive if it doesn't have allies in the world, and it's going to be sanctioned by everyone, treated like a pariah state. That liberal part of the country is what kept Israel as part of the international community, and what kept it allied with the United States, and what kept it as a big trade partner for the EU. And if Israel loses that, it's not going to be able to survive. The extreme right fringe and the fundamentalists aren't going to be able to support the Israeli economy, aren't going to be able to support Israeli society, not in the long term. Many don't serve in the army. It's a disaster for Israel. If these people take over, and this is a step towards taking over, like, make no mistake, they're hindering the functioning of the state. If they completely take over, the state of Israel will not exist in the long term. And I think that's quite a possible outcome, unfortunately. But there's a lot of people in Israel who are against this. A lot of people, maybe the majority. At this point, I have no idea. And hopefully they will fight back.
Shaila, I think it's fair. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but you would sort of politically identify as like a liberal Zionist. Is that a fair characterization of your views? So there are plenty of things that you and I wouldn't necessarily see eye to eye on. But I really wanted to put up this tweet that you sent yesterday and commend you for it, because I think this is a very difficult thing to admit when we've gotten something wrong, or to acknowledge and identify our own blind spots. So if we can put F6 up on the screen, you said in response to all of these events yesterday, I feel stupid and ashamed. In May, an expose came out on CNN detailing the abuses in State Taman. I'm sure I butchered that pronunciation. Apologies. Then the NYT released their own article on it. Both were backed up by Israeli sources crossed with Palestinian ones. Yet you say you dismiss them because your government sources and Israeli media denied them. My whole life, I was told that the international media was out to get Israel and that they were all anti-Semites. And so with that blind spot, even with the reporting, even, you had a UN report about this, you had multiple mainstream media outlet reports, you dismissed it because of the, the propaganda ecosystem that you existed in and what your own government sources were saying. So I'd love for you just to talk a little bit about that, and also talk about whether this revelation has changed your assessment in any other part of, Israel's prosecution of the war in Gaza, or Israel in general.
Yeah, okay, that is a difficult question. So as far as what was happening with State Taman,
guy right here, man, is a scammer and a phony. All his life, he thought the media and everybody was just out to get them. They was anti-Semitic. So now this report came out on what happened to the Palestinians. Now he done had an epiphany. BS. Let's see. You trying to save face. Oh, brother, you didn't believe it. You didn't believe they were sexually abusing the Palestinians.
They knew that what was going on there was very bad, and no one in Israel was denying that. It's just that the worst abuses were being covered up, the ones that like what we're talking about. And now people I spoke to who told me that these things weren't true are now telling me that they are. And that's because military censorship is no longer on some of these cases, and there's going to be
wait till the Christians in America find out how they treat the Christians over there, though. Then they really gonna be pissed that they've been fooled. They spit on them. Now they blaspheme Yeshua. How they blaspheme them. How they been desecrating Christian churches forever, knocking over the tombstones, spray painting them. The Jewish extremists, running Christians out. Man, what? Where they find it out, and then he gonna pretend like he didn't know that neither. I didn't know. I believe. I just was believing what people were saying.
The other prosecutions. So there's been a change of strategy there, and that definitely undermined a narrative that I had. It's hard to explain to people who aren't Israeli what the attitude towards the rest of the world is. There's the legacy of the Holocaust. There's a legacy of anti-Semitism. Israel is singled out in the United Nations more than any other country, and the international media focuses on Israel more than just about any other country. And what Israelis have always felt is that they're singled out by the international community, and that this has to do with the legacy of anti-Semitism. And it's not that viewpoint is not completely, it doesn't have any validity to it. It's just that it blinds us to things. So, if you say to Israelis, oh, the New York Times said this and that, they'll say, well, the New York Times, they're out to get us. They're anti-Semites. And I grew up in that attitude. And now that I've had this verified,
Revolutionary salute to our brother Golden Mask for the donation to the war chest. Revolutionary real life. Absolutely appreciate the love, family. Salute.
I see that the article. I read the article again, and I see the article was very well sourced, and it shows the kind of blind spot that we had. And now I'm going to have to rethink a lot of things. I think that the war on October 7th was absolutely just, had to happen, because after the events that occurred in Israel, they had to happen. But I've always had questions about the way we've conducted this war on multiple levels, and now I have more questions. And now I am more prone to believe reports about what Israel is doing to innocent civilians. And again, I've always believed these reports to some extent, but thought they were exaggerated. Now I'm going to be looking a lot more objectively at these numbers, a lot more objectively at this information. And I'm going to be a lot more concerned about Palestinian civilians who are being killed. I was concerned before, but I also was more skeptical about the information that I was receiving. None of this stops me from thinking that Israel needs to fight for its survival. None of this makes me stop thinking that Israel is facing people who want to destroy it. But it's making me a lot more critical of how Israel is doing it. There are a lot of people in the Israeli government who have bad intentions and have absolutely no morals. And there's a lot of people in society who back them, and I don't trust them to wage this war morally or effectively. And I think that people who support Israel need to very carefully hold their feet to the fire and criticize violations of human rights and to criticize the way that they're running this war and any Palestinian civilians who are needlessly suffering as a result of this war, and strive to end the war, get the hostages back, start to rebuild, and move towards a two-state solution. So I'm still a Zionist, but I want Israel to be more moral, and it hasn't been moral.
We appreciate you joining us, sir. Unfortunately, we're on a tight timeline, but really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you. Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show.
Man, please, brother, please. Nice try. You just pissed that everybody know what y'all been doing to them Palestinians now. And he came out and said they was lying over and over and over and over and over.
In Venezuela, let me explain what's going on. Venezuela has a lot of oil, okay? Largest oil reserves on the planet. So when the Americans start saying, well, the elections weren't fair, they're lying, okay? I mean, I'm sorry. The Americans, first of all, they have much bigger things to worry about. They have a senile president who's absent without leave. They have a cackling witch who's, you know, the unelected appointee from the DNC running in his stead. You know, don't talk to me about lack of democracy in Venezuela when this is what democracy looks like in America, okay? First of all. Second of all, you have hundreds of election observers who've gone to Venezuela and seen, you know, how the entire process works. They've witnessed the actual voting, okay? Not a demonstration of it. They witnessed it happening. So they can testify and sign off on the fact that these were transparent elections. They were legitimate. They were genuine and conducted in a democratic fashion. And you know, again, it's if you're sitting in the West and you're just believing, well, oh yeah, Maduro's a dictator and he cheated. I mean, this is ignorance. It's just ignorance. It's because you're basically confirming the brainwashing that you've been fed that, you know, anyone who's not in Europe and in America is a dictator. So, you know, obviously, if America says that this man is bad, he has to be bad. That's nonsense. I'm sorry. That's nonsense. And we know for a fact that the Americans want Venezuela's oil. They've said this openly. I mean, I can show you Donald Trump saying as much. And I haven't even begun with the Cold War history, but just watch this. Okay, just watch this.
How about we're buying Venezuela? How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
El expresidente de los Estados Unidos, Donald Trump, declaró su crimen. Un crimen de lesa humanidad contra el pueblo de Venezuela. Declaró que el objetivo de su gobierno y de la agresión y las sanciones contra Venezuela era hacer colapsar la sociedad venezolana para que el poder imperialista de Estados Unidos se apoderara del petróleo venezolano, se apoderara de las riquezas de Venezuela. Diría un buen abogado, a confesión de partes, relevo de prueba. Trump ha declarado su culpabilidad en crímenes de lesa humanidad contra el noble y pacífico pueblo de Venezuela.
This is why they don't like Donald Trump. They just don't like the fact that he is a bit candid sometimes, that he says things honestly. which again is a contradiction for a politician, to be honest. But he blurts things out. He says things that they would not say, that, we want the oil. They would say, they just wouldn't mention it, or they would maybe say it in a different manner. Donald Trump just says, we want the oil. And he did the same thing with Syria, right? We're keeping the oil. So, he's a thief. He's a thief. This man is a thief. He's a murderer and a thief. And Donald Trump's policy is not that different from Biden's. I mean, Donald Trump, he tried this Bay of Piglets. He sent like a bunch of, what was the name of that mercenary? Silver Corps. That was the name of the mercenary group that he hired to go and take out Maduro. And it didn't work. It failed. So we call it Bay of Piglets instead of Bay of Pigs, because it was an even tinier failure. So that failed. And the sanctions failed. Remember, Donald Trump surrounds himself with neoconservatives. He has John Bolton. He's got, Nikki Haley. He's got Mike Pompeo. Just scum, scummy people that are neoconservatives who believe that the Monroe Doctrine is the way to go. I mean, most American politicians do, right? But they openly threatened Venezuela. They said, we want to get rid of you. And then they worked to steal the gold that Venezuela had in England, right? So they pushed the British government and also from the Venezuelan opposition, which they control, to do that, to steal the gold, which is it's worth about £1 billion, so about $2 billion, and it's in the Bank of England. So yeah, that's a lesson, right? Don't put your money or your gold in the Bank of England. But they've basically been at war economically with Venezuela, sanctions, gold, and then also, if you remember, Venezuela had ships coming from Iran with fuel, because yes, I told you that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, but they can't refine it because they are under sanctions. The infrastructure, it's destroyed. So Iran can refine oil into fuel, and it can send it. And they did that in exchange for gold. That's why they stole the gold. So, if Venezuela would have nothing to barter, nothing left to barter with against fuel when it comes to dealing with their ally Iran. And then, the Americans would not only get the gold in the Bank of England, but they would go and hijack and literally pirate, the fuel ships that are coming from Iran to Venezuela, which, again, when you board a ship illegally and steal the cargo and sell it off, you're a pirate. That's the definition of a pirate. The United States, executes state piracy as a matter of foreign policy. Literally piracy, like no different from 300 years ago. So they have been at war with Venezuela, and they've been doing that because the logic behind U.S. sanctions is that, well, if we torture you enough, you torture your people enough with economic hardship, with lack of fuel, lack of food, lack of water, lack of everything, then they will rise up against you, because they will say, you're the source of all the pain. You're the source of all this misery. And then they will get rid of you for America. They will do it on behalf of the United States, but without the United States having to do it directly, right? If you want, you could liken sanctions to siege warfare. I do. Okay, it's like when in the Middle Ages you would go around a castle or a town or a city or whatever, and you would surround it, with the army, and you would make sure no food comes in, no supplies come in, and people just starve to death and they die of illness and disease. It's the same thing. It's just a modern equivalent of that. You don't see it visually, but it has the same effect on people. So, even school pencils inside of schools, like school supplies, stationery, they made sure that you can't have that. It's like it's that bad. But Maduro turned the inflation around since Trump's sanctions. But if you notice, when it comes to Biden, he never lifted Donald Trump's sanctions. He never lifted his sanctions on Venezuela, nor on Iran, nor on Syria. But Maduro was able to reverse that and get elected. And now they're claiming, there's fraud and all these things. No, there's no proof of that. They're throwing around this stupid graph. Look, I'll pull it up for you, which is, again, it's not an official tally, okay? I'll read this tweet to you from Ben Norton where he explains it, all right? So he says that this idea that, the elections were rigged is fake news. There were 10 options in Venezuela's election. The other 8 parties got 4.6% combined. The results are 51.2% for Maduro, 44.2% for Emugno, and 4.6% for all the others, which equals 100%. Okay, why is he doing basic math? Because people are looking at this and saying, well, this goes above 100%, right? It's they've simply rigged the election. But no, that's not what's going on. I mean, the graphic designer just didn't explain it clearly enough, okay? You see all of these things that say 4.6%. There's an orange one, there's a yellow one, there's a green one, turquoise, there's purple, there's pink. These are not separate results. They're the same result, okay? It's not clear enough. They should have been grouped into one box or a shape for it to be more visually clearer. I mean, that's it. That's it. These are all the other candidates. Okay, it's just badly explained. And on top of it, this is not the official. These were not officially published by the government. This is just from Telesur. Telesur, they do great work. They publish news about Latin America in English, but they're just a news channel. It's not the official channel of Venezuela. So this idea that, oh my God, a graphic from Telesur shows that the elections were rigged. No, it doesn't. It literally doesn't do that. You just don't understand what's going on. You have no clue what's happening in Venezuela. So, they're just lying and making up whatever garbage to instigate a soft coup. And you have the EU, foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, coming out about an hour ago and saying, oh, well, the election results in Venezuela haven't been verified. Well, why were you sitting on your ass? You know the elections are today. Where were you? Why didn't you have people there? Hundreds of election observers, international observers have been invited. You could have easily gotten an invite. You know that. You're the EU. You can do this. Don't tell me that you're incapable of going there and verifying the elections the same day as everybody else. Iran has congratulated Maduro on the election results. China have congratulated him on the election results. Are you really going to sit there and tell me that Iran and the world's #1 economy are just making things up, and they actually also have no idea what's going on? Come on, don't be that silly, please. All of this is about controlling the oil in Venezuela. They want that oil, and remember, oil is just the biggest piece of the puzzle. They want all the other precious resources they have. And you remember when it comes to Bolivia, this is another example that happened in the same period as the last coup attempt against Venezuela. They got rid of Morales, and then they tried to steal the lithium that you have in Bolivia. Evo Morales, they literally burnt his house down and his sister's house down, and they chased him out of the country. It was a coup. It was a straight up coup, and they used the OAS to do that, and they did it on the eve of the elections. So they wait till the elections happen, then they use the election results, which are perfectly fine, to claim that they're not fine. Based on what? I don't know. And they decry the election results. They try to get people whipped up into a frenzy, and then they also pay people off to ride around on motorcycles and throw cinder blocks at people or whatever. Have a little scuffle in the streets, a little punch up, to get the violence going. And then they have all of these think tanks in Washington D.C. and all of these bought diplomats and all of these bought journalists and government officials, all copying and pasting the same statement in America, in Europe. Oh, we're concerned about the election results. Haven't verified the election results. And it's just like a chorus. It's like an orchestra, it's an orchestra of verbal diarrhea. There, you can quote me on that. Okay, I'm coining that. It's an orchestra of verbal diarrhea. That is what they do. They do this with the elections in Syria. Even the Europeans and Americans will say before the elections have even happened that the election results are fake. Well, how do you know they haven't happened yet? How do you know this 2 weeks, a month in advance? You can't possibly know that. And then they go and do the same thing with Iran. Oh, the election results, we don't know. Come on. It's how convenient, all these countries that have resources and are located in geostrategic positions and don't like your foreign policy. They just so happen to have, shady election results. What a coincidence. Wow. Once again, even if you want to sit here and tell me that, the election was really rigged. Okay. Again, who are the Americans to lecture anyone about democracy? Do you know how many countries they have couped in Latin America? I think they've done every single one. I think, as a matter of fact, not every single one, but I know that they've certainly tried, and they've done double coups in some countries. There are some countries in Latin and Central America, they've couped 2 times, right? And they do this for the most, stupid reasons sometimes. It's not even necessarily a government goal. They'll do it on behalf of a corporation, like as if I know there's no difference between the two sectors. It's fascist in nature. They're working together, I know, but I'm just thinking of Chiquita Bananas in Guatemala in 1954. They just wanted banana fields. It was called United Fruit core back then. Okay, and they basically it shows you how the governments incorporate the government in the United States and the corporations. They work together. Lobbyists are literally there to make sure this happens. So in any case, they've done coups all over Latin America before, so they're in no moral position or political position to lecture anyone about democracy or fair elections, especially when Joe Biden, who people voted for in the primary, I can't believe I'm actually defending, I can't believe this, but Joe Biden, people came out in the primaries and voted for him, okay, as they want him as their DNC candidate for the Democratic National Convention. And then all of a sudden, he just, drops out and okay, that's fine. It's his right to do that. And then it goes to Kamala Harris. Well, none of these people said they want Kamala Harris as on the top of the ticket. They accepted to have her as a VP, but they didn't accept to have her as a president, right? So nevertheless, they're going to go ahead and confirm her. Probably not, but they haven't come out and said, okay, let's all of us reorganize the primary so you can actually have a democratic choice. No. It's just we, the Democratic Party, will decide for you and tell you later. So I'm just trying to impress upon you the fact that the Americans don't have a democratic process. Once again, you can just look at the fact that the popular vote in America doesn't necessarily dictate the winner of the election, which is another symptom of this lack of democracy. So the Americans have no right. They're the last people on the planet to talk to anyone about democracy. I know they'd love to bring this word up to the point that I hate it myself. I even hate saying it. I really hate it. It's like it's so fake. It's so fake. Every time they bring it up, they make you hate the word. In any case, and we're just talking about Latin America. Never mind, regime change in Iraq, regime change in Afghanistan, regime change in Syria. The planet hasn't even recovered from their containment policy with communism and the Cold War, and their assassinations in Africa, with Patrice. I mean, again, I could literally, and I've done this before, sit here all night and go through the whole list with you, and we'd have a lot of fun and do cover a lot of history. But I think my point is well taken. So just pure hypocrisy, and you have also the billionaire class chiming in, like people like Elon Musk, coming in and saying, Maduro's a dictator, and come on. I mean, I'll remind you what Elon Musk once said. He said, "We'll coup whoever we want." And when did he say that? Ironically, when they couped Morales in Latin America, in Bolivia, right? So he wasn't just talking about any place and making, a random statement. I think he deleted it afterwards or something like that. But let's look at this. This is a new clip, all right?
Y la realidad virtual, ¿quién la controla? Nuestro nuevo archienemigo, el célebre Elon Musk, que desesperado da la cara y él quisiera venirse con sus cohetes y con un ejército a invadir Venezuela. Elon Musk, menos mal que diste la cara, porque sabíamos que tú estabas detrás de todo, Elon Musk, con tu plata, con tu satélite. Pretende él controlar al mundo. Ya controla Argentina, Elon Musk. Va por el litio de ustedes, pueblo argentino. Ya controla Ecuador. Es la representación de la ideología fascista en el mundo. El poder económico respaldando la ideología fascista de extrema derecha. Antinatura, antisociedad. Y ahora entonces lo tenemos como archienemigo de la paz de Venezuela. Hoy sacó un ex. ¿Ustedes no lo vieron? Da vergüenza. Lo voy a decir porque da vergüenza. Sacó un Twitter, llamábamos antes, con unas imágenes de una gente llevándose unas cosas, unas cajas. Y resulta que era un video de por ahí, de una gente llevándose unos aires acondicionados. Entonces él dijo, la prueba contra Maduro que se robó las elecciones.
Right, so, yeah, I'll play the video for you, so I'll explain what he's referring to, okay? Elon Musk on Twitter, he said that it's messed up how people are stealing ballot boxes in Venezuela. And it turns out they were not ballot boxes, they were just air conditioners. And you can hear the woman in the video even saying that these are air conditioners. Okay, so here, let me it's been deleted now. How convenient. It's been deleted, but this is this is the video they were referring to, okay? And that's what Maduro is talking about. He's basically saying that Elon Musk is so embarrassing and has no idea what he's talking about that he thought air conditioners are ballot boxes. And yeah, it's this video. Again, those are not ballot boxes. Ballot boxes do not look like that in Venezuela. These are air conditioners. That's it. It's just a stupid video. It's a stupid video that has nothing to do with it. But you know, the other thing also is you know, like I said, he was saying, oh, he's a dictator and propping up this, you know, cutout candidate that the Americans have put forward, which is what they always do. And you remember before they had they had tried to plague Venezuela with Guaido, right? So he had under the constitution in Venezuela, if there's no one in power, you know, the head of the National Assembly is next in line. Okay, they you know, their rank, they can pull rank, and so they tried to claim that because Maduro is not the president, well, you know, he should take over. And the Americans pushed this, and then they had like all their allies, you know, unrecognize Maduro as the president and recognize Juan Guaido. It's just the guy became a joke. He became a meme because even though they officially recognized him in the United States as the president of Venezuela, he had no power because guess what? He was not the actual president. You know, it's a joke. It's like he literally became a meme because of that. Okay, so those are funny days. Those are really funny days. In any case, when it comes to Argentina, you know, basically the president, who is a fat Zionist, okay, huge, massive Zionist. Notice this: Elon Musk is a Zionist. He went to Netanyahu's speech last week and clapped for him in Congress. The president of Argentina is a Zionist. And the candidate running against Maduro, backed by the United States and Elon Musk, is a Zionist. What a coincidence. I'm not saying again that, you know, it necessarily Israel has anything to do with it, but it's not a coincidence that these imperialist people also support Zionism. You catch my drift? So yeah, basically he was basically saying, the president of Argentina, that the officers and the army in Venezuela should overthrow Maduro. Okay, so a military coup, you know, a military coup. And there you can see Milei with Netanyahu, the war criminal, and you know, I mean, it shouldn't surprise you, but nevertheless, it's a very unfortunate what's happened to Argentina. In any case, you shouldn't underestimate the interests of all these countries and the billionaires who, again, as I was saying before, the corporations work with the government. They're one and the same, which is a hallmark feature of fascism. That's literally the definition of fascism. Okay, it's one of the main characteristics of a fascist state or entity, is that the corporations are geared towards you know, the political goals of the state. They are one and the same. You know, you cannot differentiate between the two. So that is effectively what America is. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that. And Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. He has every corporate interest imaginable, right? It's logical. So I know it doesn't make sense that he would want oil because his cars run on batteries. That doesn't mean anything. Oil is still a valuable commodity, and they want to be able to extract that and make money off of it, him and his friends. I'm not just saying him alone by himself. But they want to be able to control those resources to deprive others of the oil. So people that they dislike, Cuba, you know, Iran. I mean, Iran doesn't need oil, but, you know, basically anyone who is on the bad list or the black list in America, they want to deprive them of oil and they want to make money off of it. So they want to accomplish both of these goals. And of course, you know, the Venezuelan government are in that list of bad people, which is ridiculous because it's their own, it's their resources, right? The oil belongs to the people of Venezuela. And they always say, you know, they start every sentence like that. Oh, the people of Iran, the people of Venezuela, the people of this and that. Every time you see a sentence like that from someone in the West, beginning with the people of something, I can guarantee you what follows is a lie. I can guarantee you. They do not give a crap about the people of Venezuela. They want to hurt the people of Venezuela. That is a fact. And the sanctions speak for themselves, right? It's not something they're going to do. They have already done it. They have already attacked militarily, economically. They've done these things. And so Biden is just continuing Donald Trump's policy, but doing it, as a soft coup rather than sending armed units. And Donald Trump himself is continuing Barack Obama's policy, and Barack Obama is continuing George Bush's policy. And all of this is very funny because if you go back 20, 25 years, Venezuela used to be one of the top suppliers of oil to the United States. Are you starting to understand now why they want the oil? They also want to meet their own demands. Now, if you look at the top oil producing countries, some moron who's got the brain of a 12-year-old will tell you, yeah, well, the United States is the number one producer. Why do they need oil? Because they consume more than they produce. It's not enough. So they need more oil, okay? And they have the refineries, and the refineries are geared towards Venezuelan crude, or were at least. So, I mean, Chevron, which is one of the largest oil companies, still has all of this infrastructure in Venezuela that they can reactivate, and, all the stuff that is old and has to be renewed. They can easily fix that and then get back into business. So they are pushing the U.S. government to either invade and take the oil so they can just get back to business, or maybe because we heard that there was a little chance of renegotiation happening, but then eventually nothing did. It's like the Iran nuclear deal, but on much smaller scale. So again, I'm just trying to impress upon you the size of the corporate interest in the Americans and the West saying, oh, the election results are false in Venezuela. They're not actually false. They're not actually rigged. They're perfectly fine. They just don't suit the corporations in America. They don't suit the oil demands of the United States. That's all. They want the oil. That's it. This shouldn't surprise anyone. It's no different from Iraq. They want the oil. It's not only the oil, but we have to remember that it's a big part of it. And the Monroe Doctrine comes into play, of course, because Monroe Doctrine stipulates that. This is just some mumbo jumbo that the Americans believe in, that they should control the Western Hemisphere. So anything that is north of them or south of them, meaning from Canada all the way down to Argentina, it should be geared towards American interests, specifically United States, Washington interests. It's a selfish imperialist doctrine. That's all it is. It's literally saying, I want everything for myself. If I have to assassinate a president who's in Cuba or in Latin America, in South America, then yeah, we have to do that because it's in our interests. I mean, who thinks like this? If you want to think like that, fine, but don't go around telling people you're a democracy and you care about international law. You don't. This is bandit, gangster, fascist thinking. That's what it is. But that's the Monroe Doctrine. It's just that everything from Canada to Argentina, it belongs to the United States. They should be able to kill and murder and sanction and steal and do anything that it takes to suit their interests. It's just theft. It's state criminality, but given a fancy name, Monroe Doctrine. Anyway. Just to kind of,
The U.S. government is backing yet another coup attempt in Venezuela. In the past 2 decades, Washington has sponsored several coup attempts, many of which were violent, trying to overthrow Venezuela's government. The former revolutionary president Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolás Maduro. Back in 2002, the US government backed a military coup that briefly overthrew Venezuela's democratically elected left-wing president, Hugo Chavez. This was admitted even by the mainstream British newspaper, The Guardian, which revealed that the Bush administration, George W. Bush, backed this coup in Venezuela. But it only lasted for 2 days, and the people of Venezuela flooded the streets, and they overthrew the coup regime and reinstalled in power Chavez, who continued the Bolivarian revolution that he started. So this story is not new. There have been...
Never forget that detail right there, because when the U.S. tell you the will of the people in Venezuela, the will of the people in Venezuela was when George W. Bush had Chavez overthrown and the military had Chavez hid out, the people came into the streets and demanded that they let Chavez go or they burn the country down. They had to release Chavez. I never forget that. He came on the balcony, defiant, throwing his fist around, and took back over the country. And it was a historic thing, but that's the will of the people. Why? Because they take care of the impoverished. They help the poor. So the poor always going to ride for the Venezuelan leaders. The bougie can always buy some criminals to, do what they're doing right now. But the masses of the people are behind the government.
Been so many U.S.-backed coup attempts in Venezuela just in the past few years. On July 28th, Venezuela held presidential elections, and Maduro won those elections again. However, the U.S. and its allies in Latin America have refused to recognize the results, and instead, violent extremists are burning down public institutions and government buildings and hospitals. They're destroying buses and looting offices, trying to overthrow President Maduro. And these extremists have the support of some very powerful people, like the billionaire oligarch Elon Musk, who is now campaigning for Donald Trump for president. And of course, Elon Musk, in addition to being CEO of Tesla, which has received billions of dollars of subsidies from the US government, he also is the owner of Twitter, now known as X.com. And Musk has been sharing loads of disinformation on Twitter, fake news, deceiving people about what's going on in Venezuela. And he is pretty openly calling for overthrowing President Maduro. Now, honestly, this is not very surprising because Elon Musk has a history of supporting US-backed coups in Latin America. In 2019, violent far-right extremists overthrew Bolivia's democratically elected left-wing president, Evo Morales, and the US backed this coup, and so did Elon Musk. And a critic on Twitter called out Elon Musk, and he said, quote, "You know what wasn't in the best interest of the people? The US government organizing a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia so you could obtain the lithium there. Bolivia has some of the world's largest reserves of lithium, which is needed for electric vehicles made by Tesla, the batteries in electric vehicles, the batteries in phones and cameras and computers. It's very important." And what was Elon Musk's response back in 2020? On Twitter, he said, quote, "We will coup whoever we want. Deal with it." And now, 4 years later, we can see that Musk is being very consistent and supporting yet another coup in Latin America, this time in Venezuela. And the main tactic that extremists in Venezuela are using to try to justify this coup attempt is they're claiming that there was electoral fraud. And I published an investigation, which I will link to in the description below, in which I show in great detail how the allegations of supposed electoral fraud originate with a firm in the US in New Jersey that is very closely linked to the US government and even linked to the CIA. This is a polling firm called Edison Research that works for US government propaganda organs overseen by the US Agency for Global Media, including US government propaganda outlets like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And these are propaganda organs that were created by the CIA. They were literally founded by the CIA. We know this because the New York Times admitted this back in 1977. The New York Times described these US propaganda outlets as part of a, quote, worldwide propaganda network built by the CIA. And the US polling firm that is the origin of the Venezuelan opposition's claims of supposed electoral fraud works with these US government propaganda organs that were literally founded by the CIA. So once again, we can see that Washington is playing an important role in supporting this coup attempt in Venezuela and in justifying these baseless accusations of electoral fraud. As I'll show today, there is no evidence of electoral fraud. But this is not stopping billionaire oligarchs who are closely linked to the US government, like Elon Musk, from sharing this discredited disinformation, including Elon Musk personally shared this exit poll done by the CIA-linked US government-linked firm. So we can see that when Musk threatened, quote, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it," they really mean it. They're trying it again. Today, I'm going to be analyzing the evidence that shows how completely wrong this narrative is. And before I get into great detail, I want to look at a few comments that were made by some of the independent international electoral observers who were on the ground in Venezuela. One of these groups is actually from the US. They're an independent group called the National Lawyers Guild. And as their name suggests, they consist of lawyers coming from the US. And they had a delegation of 5 US lawyers who were on the ground in Venezuela. And they said very clearly, I'm reading from their press release, quote, "The delegation observed a transparent, fair voting process with scrupulous attention to legitimacy, access to the polls, and pluralism." They said, despite the soundness of the electoral process, the US-backed opposition, with support from an anti-Maduro Western press, has refused to accept the results, undermining the stability of Venezuela's democracy. And this delegation of lawyers from the US said that they, quote, "strongly condemn these attacks on the electoral system, as well as the role of the US in undermining the democratic process." Similar comments were made by another independent international electoral observer, the human rights activist Ajamu Baraka, and he tweeted, quote, "I am in Venezuela as an observer and can say with certainty that after systematic interference by anti-democratic forces in the US, the election results represented the sentiments of the people who voted. What is not being reported is the organizing that took place to win." And he talks about how Maduro was able to win the election because he had the support from a progressive social bloc of unions, parties, student groups, women organizations, and they all moved in one common organized direction. And he said, with organization, you can resist moneyed interests, the big oligarchs and corporations that are trying to retake control of Venezuela. We can see this clearly in the response of the right-wing governments in Latin America that are controlled by oligarchs and big corporations and banks. An example of this is Argentina's far-right president, Javier Milei, who's extremely pro-US, extremely pro-Israel. Immediately after coming to office, Milei took a trip to Israel to support Benjamin Netanyahu as he carries out horrific crimes in Gaza. And Milei is, of course, a close ally of Donald Trump. They have repeatedly talked in coordinated policy. And Javier Milei is a close friend of Elon Musk, who is joining him in backing this coup attempt in Venezuela. And on Twitter, the Argentine president openly called on the military in Venezuela to overthrow President Maduro. So quite literally, he and other far-right leaders in Latin America, backed by big US corporations and banks, they're calling for a military coup in Venezuela. And I should point out, by the way, that Milei is closely collaborating with the CIA. This is not hidden. He boasts about it. The director of the CIA, William Burns, visited Argentina. He visited the presidential palace, and Milei's chief of staff went to Washington and Virginia, and he also met with the CIA. And in addition to collaborating with the CIA, Milei made an agreement for Israel's spy agency, the Mossad, to train Argentine intelligence officers. So quite literally, the CIA, Israel's Mossad, and the far right in Latin America are all openly collaborating. They're not hiding it. In fact, the current leader of the far right opposition in Venezuela is the extremist Maria Corina Machado. And she, in 2018, published a letter, an open letter on her Twitter account, in which she asked the former right-wing president of Argentina, the multimillionaire Mauricio Macri, and she asked Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's far-right prime minister, for a military intervention in Venezuela to overthrow President Maduro. I mean, they really don't hide it. It's so incredible. You don't have to be an investigative journalist to find some of this stuff. It's on their Twitter account. And this is the extremist, Machado, who the US is currently backing to try to install in power in Venezuela. And there could not be a starker contrast between these far-right Venezuelan extremists like Maria Corina Machado, who love Israel and the US, and on the other hand, the leftist Chavista movement and people like President Nicolas Maduro, who have been huge supporters of Palestine, some of the world's biggest supporters of Palestine. Maduro always speaks in support of Palestine. He broke off diplomatic relations with Israel. And then there, of course, is the geopolitical angle, because while the US and right-wing governments in Latin America that are run by oligarchs, they have refused to recognize Venezuela's electoral results. However, the left-wing governments in Latin America have recognized Venezuela's electoral results. And in addition, China, Russia, and Iran have come out recognizing Maduro. So once again, as we see with so many conflicts in the world, the US is trying to turn this into a proxy war in this new Cold War. And the US is trying to isolate any countries that have an independent foreign policy and ultimately try to overthrow their government. In another video that I did, which I will link to in the description below, I analyzed why the US government has been so obsessed with trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government for decades now. And I talked about how geopolitics is a big element, because ever since the beginning of the leftist Bolivarian revolution, started by President Hugo Chavez when he came to power in 1999, Venezuela has tried to pursue a multipolar foreign policy, try to build a multipolar world. Venezuela has formed close ties with China and Russia and Iran. Venezuela has built regional institutions to try to integrate Latin America politically and economically through things like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, and the Bolivarian Alliance, the ALBA. Venezuela tried to challenge the hegemony of the US dollar and help to create a new currency for Latin America to trade so they don't have to use the US dollar. And then, of course, there's the issue of natural resources. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. And not just that, they were nationalized and they now belong to the people of Venezuela, overseen by a state-owned company, PDVSA. And Hugo Chavez kicked out all of the US oil corporations. So Donald Trump, when he was president, he tried to oversee a coup to overthrow Venezuela's government. And in 2023, he admitted that the US wanted to take over Venezuela and pillage its oil.
Venezuela. How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
And furthermore, Donald Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, John Bolton, likewise admitted in an interview on Fox News that the Trump administration was working with US oil corporations that wanted to profit from exploiting Venezuela's oil.
We're looking at the oil assets. That's the single most important income stream to the government of Venezuela. We're looking at what to do to that. We're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or, in the case of Citgo, here in the United States. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela.
Of course, you all probably remember the US coup attempt that Donald Trump launched in 2019, in which Washington recognized a little-known right-wing opposition figure, Juan Guaido, as the supposed president of Venezuela, despite the fact that he had never participated in a presidential election. And the fact that this was a coup attempt is not even hidden. It was Donald Trump's neoconservative national security advisor, John Bolton, who, by the way, was one of the architects of the Iraq War. And he boasted in an interview on CNN that he had experience organizing coups, and he named Venezuela as an example of somewhere he had experience organizing coups.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work.
I do want to ask a follow-up.
when we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup. And you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
successful coups?
Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful.
Now, that coup attempt obviously failed. Juan Guaido never came even remotely close to power in Caracas. But today, the U.S. is backing basically the same strategy under the Democrats now, under Joe Biden, that Trump did. And instead of Juan Guaido, the U.S. is refusing to recognize Maduro and is backing the far-right extremist Maria Corina Machado, who has repeatedly called on the U.S. and Israel to militarily intervene to overthrow Venezuela's government. And she's doing this in collaboration with a man that people are jokingly calling the Joe Biden of Venezuela. His name is Edmundo Gonzalez. He is a right-wing oligarch. He is not popular at all. And in fact, he barely even speaks. It's obvious that the real force behind him is Machado, who is this far-right extremist who has been backed by the U.S. government for many years. Machado has led opposition organizations and right-wing political parties that have been funded with millions of dollars from the U.S. government. And she's such a close ally of Washington that U.S. President George W. Bush personally invited her to the White House in 2005 for a one-on-one meeting. This is the extremist U.S. puppet that the U.S. is trying to install in power in Venezuela yet again. Now, I want to briefly go through some of the recent history of the many U.S.-backed coup attempts in Venezuela. I mentioned that in 2002, the George Bush administration backed a briefly successful military coup that overthrew democratically elected President Hugo Chavez. After the military physically removed Chavez from power, a right-wing millionaire businessman who was the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Venezuela, named Pedro Carmona, declared himself so-called president, despite the fact that he was not elected. And the U.S. government supported him because this is what Washington wants. They want oligarchs in control of Venezuela who will sell off Venezuela's natural resources to U.S. corporations. They don't care about democracy at all. And the Guardian newspaper revealed that the Bush administration was involved in this coup, and in particular, it named some of the former Ronald Reagan administration officials who oversaw the CIA war on Central America in the 1980s, in particular on the revolutionary Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Some of these war criminals were brought back, including the convicted criminal Elliot Abrams, who was a key figure involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. And then when Donald Trump came to power, he brought back this literal convicted criminal, Elliot Abrams, to oversee the Venezuela coup attempt. In January 2019, right as the Trump administration was launching this coup attempt in Venezuela, Donald Trump named notorious neoconservative Elliot Abrams as his special envoy for Venezuela. And he reused some of those same tactics that the CIA used against Nicaragua in the 1980s, this time in Venezuela. But like I said, the 2019 Trump administration coup attempt against Venezuela was simply the latest in a long line. In fact, going back to the very first election that Nicolás Maduro won in 2013, US-backed right-wing opposition forces in Venezuela have always refused to recognize the election results. In 2013, they also claimed supposedly that there was fraud. And of course, they had no evidence, just like they're claiming fraud once again today. And these coup attempts backed by the US have often been very violent. After Hugo Chavez died in 2013, and then Nicolás Maduro won the election in 2013 and became president. Then in 2014, there was another violent US-backed coup attempt, and far-right extremists began burning government buildings, attacking Chavistas, left-wingers, and they created these notorious barricades that were known as guarimbas. And these were not peaceful protesters, although the Western media falsely claimed they were. They were armed, usually with mortar cannons. There were some who had guns, but many of them instead had these makeshift cannons that are known as morteros. And these things are extremely lethal. They're not non-violent protesters. Many people lost their lives because of these far-right extremists shooting left-wing supporters of the government, Chavistas as they're known. Average people, average families in Venezuela lived in terror for many months in 2014 during these violent US-backed riots. And one of the main leaders of this US-backed coup attempt was the far-right extremist Leopoldo Lopez, who is from one of the richest oligarch families in Venezuela. And you know who the other main leader of this US-backed coup attempt was? Once again, Maria Corina Machado, who is so close to the US government, she was invited to the White House for a one-on-one meeting with George Bush. And she is the US puppet that the Biden administration is trying to put in power today. So these same coup leaders in Venezuela come back again and again and again. And meanwhile, the US government and its mouthpieces in the Western media absurdly claim that Venezuela is a so-called dictatorship. Meanwhile, all of these coup plotters who have participated in violent attempts to overthrow the government, they're not in prison. They're walking around free, like Machado. If these extremists carried out these kinds of actions and coup attempts in the US, they would be in prison. But in the so-called dictatorship in Venezuela, they're all walking around free because Venezuela is not a dictatorship. And meanwhile, supplementing these US-backed coup attempts in Venezuela, which were often violent, you also have the brutal sanctions that Washington has imposed on Venezuela going back to Barack Obama before Donald Trump, going back to 2015. In that year, nearly a decade ago now, Obama issued a completely ridiculous executive order that, quote, declared a national emergency with respect to the unusual and an extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States posed by the situation in Venezuela. This is completely preposterous. I remember when this happened at the time, it was laughable. Can you imagine actually believing that Venezuela is somehow a national security threat to the US? Do they think that Venezuela is going to invade Washington or bomb Washington? It is completely absurd. And yet every single year since, in the past 9 years, every US president, Obama, Trump, and Biden, has renewed this executive order every year. And why is that? Because this is how the White House justified imposing illegal unilateral sanctions on Venezuela, waging economic war. It was Obama who started imposing the sanctions, and then Donald Trump took them to a whole new extreme level. And in 2019, when Trump initiated the coup attempt with Juan Guaido, he imposed a full economic embargo on Venezuela, like the illegal US economic embargo that has been on in Cuba for over 60 years now. And that the entire world, the entire international community votes to condemn every single year in the UN General Assembly. But the US and Israel are the only countries that support this illegal criminal blockade. Now, in 1960, the US State Department published an internal memo in which they admitted that the goal of the US sanctions on Cuba was to, quote, weaken the economic life of Cuba, to, quote, make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. And this is exactly the same strategy that Washington is using to try to suffocate Venezuela today. In 2019, a top Trump administration official admitted, and this was published by Univision, which is one of the most anti-Venezuela media outlets imaginable. This top US official said, he boasted that the US sanctions on Venezuela were like Darth Vader's grip around the throat of the Venezuelan economy. This is how sadistic and criminal and barbaric these US government officials are. They're willingly comparing themselves to Darth Vader, the villain of Star Wars, and saying, yeah, what Darth Vader did to his victims by suffocating them, That's what we are doing to Venezuela, to the Venezuelan people, and we're proud of it. And this explains the economic crisis in Venezuela. It is by far the most important factor in causing and exacerbating that economic crisis and hyperinflation and other problems in Venezuela. And this has been acknowledged even by Venezuelan economists who are critics of the Venezuelan government. For instance, the Venezuelan economist Francisco Rodriguez is a critic of Maduro. He does not support the Venezuelan government. He's part of the opposition, but he's not an extremist. He's not far right like many of the leaders. And he published research, including a study in 2023 titled The Human Consequences of Economic Sanctions. And in this report, he showed how the US sanctions devastated Venezuela's oil industry, sabotaging its production. And the more the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela, it prevented the government from exporting its oil. It prevented the government from signing trade agreements and doing transactions with other countries because oil is still mostly traded in the US dollar. It blocked Venezuela from the international financial system. It also made sure that no foreign investors would come anywhere close to the Venezuelan oil industry. It made it almost impossible for Venezuela to import technology that it needed to modernize and maintain its oil industry. It made it almost impossible for Venezuela to import the parts that it needed for much of this technology because most of Venezuela's oil industry was still using technology built in other countries like in the US or in Europe, in Germany and Switzerland, and Venezuela was unable to import those parts, which meant that in addition to being unable to simply process its oil transactions and trade, it was unable to maintain its oil infrastructure. And the US government was proud of this. They boasted. The US Energy Information Administration, the EIA, published a report in 2019 during Trump's coup attempt titled Venezuelan crude oil production falls to lowest levels since January 2003, which, by the way, was part of another US-backed coup attempt in Venezuela. So here we can see that the US government was gloating. They were proud of the fact that they had completely paralyzed Venezuela's oil industry, which completely devastated the Venezuelan economy. Because the reality is that Venezuela has been a petrostate for a century. Well before the birth of Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan economy has relied on oil, just like Saudi Arabia. Its economy has relied on oil. And like Venezuela, Saudi Arabia has been trying to diversify its economy, but that is very difficult to do when so much of your economy is based on oil. And the top United Nations expert on sanctions published a report in 2021. It's on the website of the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. Her name is Alina Duhan. She's an international human rights expert and lawyer, and she was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. The UN has these very long titles, but she was the top UN expert on sanctions. And in this report, the UN expert emphasized that US sanctions and European sanctions on Venezuela are illegal. They are unilateral coercive measures. They do not have the support of the UN Security Council and therefore violate international law. And she wrote, quote, unilateral sanctions increasingly imposed by the United States, the European Union, and other countries have exacerbated the economic crisis in Venezuela. She said, quote, the government's revenue was reported to shrink by 99%. The government lost 99% of its revenue. The country is currently living on 1% of its pre-sanctions income. And again, that's because Venezuela for 100 years has been a petrostate. And well before Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution, the government relied on oil revenue to fund its operations. The difference is that previously, a small handful of oligarchs, wealthy capitalists, were basically stealing that oil wealth and using it to enrich themselves and their friends. And instead, Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999 and he launched the Bolivarian Revolution. And he said, the oil belongs to the people of our country, and we're going to use it to fund social programs and build housing units, millions of housing units, and create free education and healthcare and jobs programs. And by the way, despite the extreme economic difficulties in Venezuela, President Maduro has continued these policies that were started by Hugo Chavez. In fact, right before the election, Maduro announced that the government had built the housing unit number 5,100,000, more than 5 million housing units for poor and working class families in Venezuela. And they plan on building 3 million more social housing units by 2030. They're investing so many resources in trying to help poor and working people. And this is exactly why Nicolás Maduro won the election. And it's why the opposition keeps losing the election, because the majority of people in Venezuela are working class. They are not the small handful of elite oligarchs who have dual passports and spend half their time living in Miami or Madrid. They are working class people from humble barrios, and they support Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution because they have received tangible benefits, despite the brutal U.S. economic war waged against them, that, in the words of U.S. government officials, is like Darth Vader's grip around the throat of the Venezuelan economy, trying to destroy it. In fact, the irony is that Venezuela now has lower inflation than Argentina, which has become the poster boy of the far right. Argentina's libertarian president, Javier Milei, has been imposing brutal neoliberal shock therapy, mass privatizations, destroying entire government ministries. And meanwhile, Argentina, as of March 2024, has annual inflation of 288%, which is by far the worst inflation in the entire region. You can thank his neoliberal, libertarian, free market fundamentalist economic policies for that. Meanwhile, in Venezuela, despite the continued U.S. economic war, the brutal U.S. sanctions and embargo, Venezuela's annual inflation is 68%, which is a small fraction of Argentina's inflation. In the UN report that I mentioned earlier, this top UN expert also talked about some of the other economic difficulties that have been caused by the illegal US sanctions. She noted that, quote, the hardening of sanctions faced by the country since 2015 undermines the potential positive impact of the current reforms, as well as the state's capacity to maintain infrastructure and implement social projects. Today, Venezuela faces a lack of necessary machinery, spare parts, electricity, water, fuel, gas, food, and medicine. Again, because the US has been waging a war on Venezuela. What happens in war? Many people flee the country. There are refugees and migrants, like the US war in Iraq, and the US war in Afghanistan, and the US war in Syria, the US war in Yemen, and also the US hybrid war, an economic war on Venezuela. President Maduro has been a wartime president. Ever since he entered office, the US has not given the people of Venezuela one day to breathe. It has been tormenting them with this endless hybrid war. And then when Donald Trump launched the coup attempt in 2019, the US and its European allies began to steal billions of dollars of Venezuelan assets held abroad, as this UN expert pointed out. Furthermore, the illegal Western sanctions made the purchase of goods and payments by public companies impossible because they were blocked or frozen. Even private companies in Venezuela faced rejection or reluctance of foreign banks to open or keep open their bank accounts because of the fear of US sanctions. They had to pay extra insurance costs, which led to high inflation because in order to import products, they become more expensive to import. And then you also have the issue of over-compliance of sanctions, because even if a Venezuelan institution is not directly sanctioned, foreign companies and foreign exporters and foreign banks, they might be afraid of doing business with Venezuelan firms, not only government firms, but also private companies, because they're afraid of secondary sanctions. They're afraid that they might get sanctioned by the US for doing business with Venezuelans. So the US and European countries have been waging brutal economic war on Venezuela. The Bank of England stole $1.2 billion worth of gold that belonged to the Venezuelan people. And by the way, with the price of gold massively increasing, this is now around $2 billion. The US has also been trying to steal from Venezuela Citgo, which was a state-owned oil refinery company, and it had a lot of branches based in the United States. It was actually based in Houston, Texas. And during the Trump administration's coup attempt in 2019, they stole Citgo and gave it to Juan Guaido, this US puppet, and they proceeded to bankrupt Citgo, these corrupt US-backed coup leaders. They use it as their personal piggy bank, and now the US is basically going to steal it from them and turn it into US corporate property. And by the way, Citgo is worth many billions of dollars. So this is another example of the US stealing billions of dollars from the Venezuelan people. And I haven't even talked yet about the failed US-backed invasion of Venezuela in 2020, in which former US military officers led a group of Colombian paramilitary forces and Venezuelan traitors that were trained by the US in Colombia. And one of the leaders of this attempted invasion admitted that the CIA was involved in backing this failed operation that was jokingly called Bay of Piglets. But like the failed CIA invasion of Cuba in Bay of Pigs, the CIA-backed failed invasion of Venezuela in 2020, this was very serious. It was called Operation Gideon. They were trying to invade a foreign country and violently overthrow its elected government. Meanwhile, it's the US government and the far-right Venezuelan opposition forces it's backing who are the ones absurdly claiming that there's supposed electoral fraud in Venezuela today. And there's no evidence of this. As I explained in an investigation, which I will link to in the description below, the allegations of supposed fraud, the allegations that claim that the Venezuelan opposition supposedly won, come from a US firm that works with US government propaganda outlets founded by the CIA. And I was going to talk in more detail about this investigation today, but I've actually gone way too long in this episode today. So instead, I'm going to actually continue that discussion in a separate episode where I go into detail showing how the US government-backed firm based in New Jersey, Edison Research, which works with propaganda organs founded by the CIA, they are the origin of these false allegations of electoral fraud. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just the US government that is backing these false allegations, but it's also billionaire oligarchs like Elon Musk and the right-wing governments in Latin America that are backing this coup attempt. But I'm going to talk about that in greater detail in a separate episode. But I thought it was very important to talk about some of these details about the US-backed coup attempt in Venezuela.
If my colleagues will indulge me for just 1 minute, I want to speak quickly to the elections that just took place in Venezuela. We applaud the Venezuelan people for their participation in the July 28th presidential election. We commend their courage and commitment to democracy in the face of repression and in the face of adversity. We've seen the announcement just a short while ago by the Venezuelan Electoral Commission. We have serious concerns that the result announced does not reflect the will or the votes of the Venezuelan people. It's critical that every vote be counted fairly and transparently, that election officials immediately share information with the opposition and independent observers without delay, and that the electoral authorities publish the detailed tabulation of votes. The international community is watching this very closely and will respond accordingly.
Well, joining us now from Venezuela is Ajamu Baraka, chair of the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace and senior editor at the Black Agenda Report. You may also recognize him as the vice presidential candidate with the Green Party in 2016. Ajamu, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
So you observed the elections. Is Secretary Blinken right? Did the result announced not reflect the will or the vote of the Venezuelan people?
We have no understanding why he has taken that position. Clearly, he has information that no one else has. One of the things that one can conclude about elections in Venezuela is that it doesn't really matter if you support the current government or not. It's pretty clear that most people consider that the process here, the voting process, is one of the cleanest in the world. So if there's going to be charges of fraud, then those charges have to be provided.
Just never forget that. When they say, if you listen to the news, when they tell you he's a dictator and he's rigging elections, they never break the elections down. They're one of the hardest to rig because they knew the U.S. was going to keep doing this. It's damn near impossible to rig these elections. The U.S. don't want to talk about that, though.
With empirical evidence. They have a process here where they have the opposition to station their observers in the various voting booths. They have a biometric validation of the voter. They have a two-step process that doesn't exist in the U.S. where you have a paper ballot to verify your electronic vote so that those two numbers will correspond if everything is correct. And they have audits before, during, and after the vote. So you can't just make an assertion that there's supposed to be irregularities without providing some empirical evidence to back that up. And that hasn't happened because it doesn't really exist. So again, this is part of the Western narrative to undermine the legitimacy of the process in Venezuela, simply because the U.S. government, the U.S. state, is opposed to the Venezuelan experiment.
Yeah, it's really interesting that Secretary Blinken would say this when the reality is the U.S. wasn't there. There was no one there from the United States to actually observe this election, from the government of the United States, I should say. Obviously, you were there. There's others who were there looking at, observing the election, but no one from the government was actually there. So what evidence do they have to say this was a sham election, essentially, like they've always said over and over? How did you get involved? So how did you become an election observer there?
Well, there was an invitation to bring in people from around the world because I think there was an understanding that there was probably going to be this attempt to try to undermine the legitimacy of the process. So the Black Alliance for Peace was invited to send a representative, and they chose me to come down to be that person. This is not the first time I've been in Venezuela to observe elections. In fact, this is the third time. So I have some experience here also. So it was a very eye-opening experience, though, for people who hadn't done it before. They were really impressed, again, with this process. And when we were actually in the field observing the vote yesterday, many people from around the world who had seen this for the first time or was watching it for the first time were impressed with things like, for example, within a 3-block radius or so, there was something like 8 different polling places. There were tremendous lines, but it was clear that people were going to have an opportunity to, in fact, cast their votes. Something that you don't see in the U.S., where you have one precinct that is attempting to satisfy the voting desire of thousands of people sometimes. So this is part of the experience that they have perfected here, I think, in Venezuela.
Tell us the difference of how the people vote in Venezuela compared to the United States. Like, what do you see that they're doing versus how we do it? That's ways that are different and ways that are even similar.
Well, and then one thing is, as I just indicated, the number of polling places. The process of having a paper ballot to back up your electronic vote. The fact that that there is a process in which,
with a situation like this is where what really pisses me off about the Congressional Black Caucus, which just once again evidence. Like I say, Libya really destroyed me on them. That was my eye-opening event when they put them black people in cages. They never set them up in the world. I'm like, wow, these people here really don't give a damn about us. Okay, when you take a situation like this, they will say the dictator Maduro, and you see them like, what? They know what America is doing. This is about imperialism. This is about stealing. They're starving Venezuelans and saying until you overthrow your leader by force or at those polls, you quit, like Hamas. They're saying, hey, well, okay, Palestinians, you voted Hamas in, so you deserve to die. You see, when they don't get the results they want, then this is rigged. We really can't believe this. So we can't believe it. We're gonna starve the people out. So all those people they say they love, we really love the Venezuelan people. Well, why you want to let them get toothpaste and toilet paper and medicine and things of that nature? See, they force the people to try to overthrow their people. But see, these nations been living, with less than the rest, so they okay with that. They want
people are
life,
encouraged to, in fact, vote by having
for a better life.
The election on the weekend as opposed to a working day. These are just some of the technical differences you see in Venezuela that we don't have in the United States of America.
When you talk to the Venezuelan people right now that the election has been announced, and if Secretary Blinken's right and this is a sham election and this doesn't reflect the will of or the vote of the actual people, I would imagine that there would be large demonstrations on the street, people all screaming that this was a sham, that they're living in a dictatorship. I mean, what's the sentiment on the street right now that the results have been announced?
Well, as you can imagine, it is sort of polarized between those voters that gave their vote to the current government and the opposition. Now, the opposition, of course, has issues because they were split themselves. But in certain neighborhoods,
and the problems that go on in Latin America is indigenous versus the colonizers' kids. So here you have, and like in Bolivia and a lot of those other countries, Nicaragua, you have the indigenous. Remember, Venezuela say they Afro-Latin. They've always said that. Hugo Chavez said that, just like Cuba said they Afro-Latin. Strong ties to black people all over the world. That's why they sent their troops to help fight. But who you have the seeds of the Spaniards, the bougie elite in these countries, who trying to sell out the poor, the impoverished, so they can stay wealthy. They don't give a damn about the country. They more lean towards the colonizers, Europe, U.S.
there's a resistance. In fact, I was telling Ben that I'm here in the hotel. I had planned to be someplace else for the meeting, but because this hotel is in a community that
down there right now
is a oppositional community, if you will, we have not been allowed to leave the hotel because, as people might remember, the opposition here in Venezuela is very violent.
I'm trying to.
They were responsible for burning people alive.
Your brother putting his life on the line. That's why I know he's a soldier. He trying to do the right thing. But those people, see, coming on here too, the CIA gonna put him on their list, man. So he'll be down there. They'll try to make it look like a carjacking, or somebody give me your wallet and then just shoot him. They try to get just with some crime, but now it was a hit by the government for him going down there proving those elections was fair.
Alive, killing people in various gruesome ways a few years ago. So you have to be very, very cautious with this opposition. So they are in the streets. They are making noises. They don't accept the results. And so it is something that will probably continue for the next few days. But in terms of, for the most part, for the rest of the country,
I just hope that Maduro and the Venezuelan military and they spy agencies don't activate some of the cells that they already sent over here. This dirty war. They might give the U.S. a taste of their own medicine, bro. You see what I'm saying? It might be some things go on over here, and then they just say it's criminal gangs, but really, if some of their people causing chaos, but you fight chaos with chaos. We collateral damage to our government playing dangerous games with these people. Because these people can do it to us. It don't have to be a Venezuela. They could be for Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua. They could pay the cartel to do it. You see, we playing a dangerous game, man. That we don't deserve to be caught up in this power play for other people's resources.
I think their satisfaction that their voices have been heard. They understand that the decision was going to be between surrendering their dignity and independence, versus becoming a puppet of the U.S. or standing strong and independent. So this is something they understood. If you talk to voters yesterday, and it's quite clear that for the most part, even though they know they're going to suffer, there's going to be more sanctions probably. The sentiment of the people was that they were going to stand strong with their process, with their experiment, and to maintain their dignity and independence.
What is it that people like about Maduro versus those who don't like Maduro? Is there a difference that you can see from the two sides? I mean, here in the United States, sometimes it's a little difficult to determine why a person, what would compel a person to vote Democrat versus Republican. I mean, we do have some stats that are, okay, it's majority, this one group that votes this way, or this one group that votes the other, or people who care about XYZ issue, might vote Democrat versus Republican. What are you seeing there in Venezuela, those that are supportive of Maduro versus those who support the opposition?
Well, one of the differences we have in a space like Venezuela is that even though we know that it's framed outside Venezuela, primarily in the West, in North America, as this clash of personalities, for the most part here, it's about politics. It's about the structures and parties as opposed to personalities. And so the people who are supporting and who voted for Maduro as the leader, if you will, of their process, did that because they believe in the process itself, the politics represented by the Venezuelan Socialist Party. Their attempt to try to bring about a revolutionary, fundamental change in their country. So these are the terms of struggle in this country, as opposed to personality struggles we find in places like the United States. So the issues here is independent development. It is developing structures that will allow for people to fully develop their humanity. It's about centering the needs of the people and seeing those needs as fundamental human rights needs. Is about maintaining their independence. So, these are the ideals that they believe that they are supporting. And it's about solidarity, they see, for not only the people of Venezuela, but the people in this region. They want to have a situation where they can experience peace as opposed to this constant war and being subjected to these illegal sanctions. And people need to remember, these sanctions are in fact illegal. But these illegal sanctions that have been imposed on them in order to undermine the possibility of their process.
And it's an act of war.
What type of person votes for the opposition? What do they support?
Many of them are individuals who want to see a return to the past, where Venezuela was one of the most unequal societies in the region. They are very much opposed to any idea that they're going to the economy will be transformed, the power will shift to workers. They want very much to see a society in which people like Maduro and the idea of socialism are crushed to the ground. And so they don't want to see any change. In fact, they want to return to the past. They are pro-capitalist. And is reflected in their values and their behavior. The way they deal with political differences is to engage in violence, even though we know that the narrative in the West, in the U.S. in particular, is the opposite. They're supposed to be the supporters of the revolution that are the violent ones, but that's not the case. And most people in the world know that to be true.
Yeah. The election was still fairly close. I mean, it wasn't close, not like what we see here in the US, but it was, the opposition still got over 40% of the vote. So it seems like there's a lot of people who do support that idea versus the other side, right?
No, there's no question.
Class warfare.
There's no question that there's support for the right. But you know, Kim, is a situation for those of us who've been around a while that it reminds us of what happened in Nicaragua, where the people were basically beaten down by years of counter-revolutionary violence and sanctions, and it resulted in, by 1990, the Sandinista movement losing political power. The sanctions that are imposed on Venezuela has the intent of, in fact, doing that, of beating people down, of creating economic hardships to undermine support for the process, to help people to, or have people to come to the conclusion that the socialist experiment is not worth it. The U.S. authorities understood that those sanctions are going to drive people out of the country and really bring them to the borders. You can't understand the situation with the border and the U.S. without understanding the consequences of the draconian sanctions that have been imposed on Venezuela and other countries here in the region.
Yeah, it's definitely there's definitely something very, very amiss in Venezuela, whether it be caused by the United States or whatever the causes are. Those of that is, we are seeing a lot of Venezuelans leave Venezuela, and a lot of them are coming here to the United States. They're showing up at the border, so there's definitely a crisis there. And if the root cause is the United States.
Listen, that's wherever the U.S. imperialists go. I've spoken on that before. You wonder how the Japanese, the Koreans, people from Vietnam, the Asians, how did they flood this way? When we wage war on Japan, when we wage war on Korea, when we wage war on Venezuela, and then we give them stores and all kind of other stuff because they sold their people out. Same thing in the Middle East. How you think all these Middle Eastern people, how they get all this stuff? From Jordan, from Iraq. They don't want to tell you where they're from. Even Iranians, they sold their people out, and the U.S. promised them citizenship and promised them businesses. It's the same freaking thing. It's going to happen on a mass scale in Venezuela because they're not going to put up with all these traitors for too long. They're going to get rid of them and run them towards that border, and we're going to have a mass migration. Any war, any type of war, and it's going to really be bad. You get 30 million illegals coming to America.
It's constantly trying to topple the government of Venezuela, install their own government in Venezuela, sanctioning Venezuela, doing all of these things. That is a question I think that the American people should ask the government, our government. How does this benefit us? What do you think because clearly it doesn't. I mean, if we've got floods of Venezuelans coming to the border, it isn't helping the United States. It isn't in the best interest of the American people. What do you think it is that the U.S. wants? Like, why are they so hell-bent on getting rid of Maduro? We saw them give a standing ovation to Juan Guaido during the State of the Union. They tried to install him as the president. Even though they're claiming they're for democracy, they then pick out their guy and try to put him in place as if that's somehow democratic. They've tried to coup Maduro, kill Maduro. I mean, they've tried all of these various things, all in the name of democracy, ironically. What do you think it is that the U.S. really has it out for Venezuela for? Is it simply just we need to stop the rise of socialism? Is there something else there that the U.S. wants? What do you think it is?
You kind of hit the nail on the head, your last comment, that basically any notion of a socialist alternative is a threat to the U.S. And so they want to make sure that these experiments are not successful. And so that is the main objective, to drive people away from the process, to undermine the ability of the governments in places like Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua to turn away from the idea that there in fact can be an alternative to the kind of capitalist barbarism that's been normalized in most of the world. So yeah, that's the objective, and the consequence has been the suffering of the Venezuelan people. People have to remember that, for example, at the height of the pandemic, it was the U.S. government that was undermining the ability of the Venezuelans to be able to secure things as simple as COVID testing kits. And when the even when it was made available, when the vaccines were made available, they attempted to undermine the ability of the government to secure vaccines, and the result was thousands of people unnecessarily losing their lives. So this is the kind of draconian activity that the U.S. state is involved in, simply to make sure that there are no viable alternatives to what they see as the normalized process of capitalist the development and their so-called liberal democracy, a democracy that we see unraveling in the U.S. as they are interfering in the democratic processes of countries around the world, and in particular here in Venezuela.
Yeah. I would imagine, with you having been the vice presidential candidate in 2016 for the Green Party, that you're perhaps still supporting the Green Party, would be my guess. That perhaps you're supporting Jill Stein, Dr. Jill Stein. What do you think would be the policies of Dr. Jill Stein if she were to win the presidency toward Venezuela, and compare her policy to what you think? Well, we've seen Trump in action, what he would do when it comes to Venezuela versus what you think Kamala Harris would do when it comes to Venezuela.
I'm quite sure that Dr. Stein would not continue to pursue illegal activities like the sanction regime that the U.S. has imposed on Venezuela. I'm sure that she will be faithful in her commitment to have the U.S. live in harmony with its neighbors, not attempt to impose its ideals on the peoples of this region and really of the world. So there should be a fundamental change in the relationship between the U.S. And the Venezuelan government. We all recognize, and Dr. Stein recognizes, that with the Democrats and the Republicans, the policy toward Venezuela is the same. People have to remember that it was the Obama administration that really intensified the subversion of Venezuela, and that was continued under Trump and under Biden. So there's a bipartisan commitment on the part of the elite in the U.S. to undermine this process. Why Venezuela? It's because of the role that Venezuela plays on a regional level. Its oil wealth was shared throughout the region. The regional development was really dependent on a viable Venezuelan economy. So the U.S. strategy of full spectrum dominance that has a regional focus, where they attempt to undermine any regional power that can threaten U.S. interests, was fully implemented here in this region. And that's why Venezuela found itself in the crosshairs of U.S. subversion, attempts to murder Maduro, and to dismantle the revolutionary process. That's why they reimpose all kinds of sanctions, including the continuation of the embargo on Cuba. That's why they've been attempting to try to undermine Nicaragua, help to support coup attempts in Bolivia and in Peru, coup the government of Honduras, and the list goes on and on. This is an anti-democratic process that the U.S. pursues, and that's why many of us make the argument that the greatest existential threat to democracy and human rights emanates not from countries like Venezuela, but in fact from the United States of America.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think we should be a beacon and an example for the world, but then ultimately the people in these other countries need to decide for themselves if they see America and they love the way America's run and they think that's the way I want my country run, they will work on their own to change that within their own countries. They don't need us to come and rescue them from their dictators, the people that we label as dictators. It's so, to me, demeaning. It's also dehumanizing when Americans think that we're the big bad, we're the heroes. We're so much better than all the people in the world that we can do what they can't do. They can't take care of themselves. They're like little children. Really, we should just be a shining beacon. We should be an example if we could get our act together, of course. And then other countries will want to emulate that if they think that what we have is really great. But if they don't, then they won't. And that's just the reality of it.
Socialist dictator Nicolas Maduro wins Venezuelan elections again after rigging them in his favor. Is exactly what we knew the United States would say, because they literally say this after every single Venezuelan election. I'm just going to go ahead and start off this conversation by letting you know that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and the United States doesn't have access to it. Probably also important to know that CIA asset Corina Machado, a opponent of Maduro, Gonzalez, promised to open up the markets to multinational corporations that would, of course, favor the United States. Also, let's not forget that the same people that are claiming that Maduro rigged the election now and that every vote should count and that they have to protect Venezuela's democracy tried to anoint Juan Guaido, who wasn't even respected in his own party, let alone Venezuela, just a few years ago. So before you go and post debunked propaganda like this, only to get community noted like this, maybe you should hear some of the facts before you go embarrassing yourself. Some of you all might not know this, but once upon a time, Jimmy Carter actually said Venezuela has some of the most secure elections in the world. Since that time, Venezuela's elections have only become more secure by necessity, because otherwise you leave yourself open to having your elections rigged by the United States in the West. So Venezuela actually has to make their elections secure in case of a situation like Bolivia, where the United States does successfully overthrow the government. They can actually vote their way back in power because of how secure their elections actually are. For example, here, Fiorella Isabel, an election integrity expert that's actually been to Venezuela to inspect their elections, discusses how they have to use biometrics in order to make sure that no one gets to vote more than once. And they even audit automatically 54% of the votes after they're taken. And that audit has to match everything, has to match from paper ballots to electronic ballots 100% before they proceed, which is more than what we can say for the United States. Beyond that, each party is given an encrypted key that they have to use to verify the ballots before there can be declared a winner. So while there may be people bitching on social media about how there are people questioning the results, the opposition party and the other parties already certified their results. They've already done it. Another great way for us to figure out if the integrity of elections should come into question is to see if the president is representative of the legislative body, which of course is picked by the people in the localities of any given country. Maduro's party holds 256 seats out of 277. Once again, this is very similar to Bolivia. They claim that Evo Morales did not have a majority support of the country, but in actuality, the legislative body was filled with the majority of his party members. So when there was an election held after the coup in Bolivia, a member of Evo Morales' party won, because that was always the popular party. He was always the popular candidate, and those policies were popular in the country. Oh, and by the way, once again, did I mention that Venezuela has the largest supply of crude oil in the world, and the US doesn't have access? So come on, guys. You cannot like the president, you cannot like socialism, but you don't have to scream fraudulent election every single time you don't like a candidate. It delegitimizes legitimate cases of election fraud. Beyond that, it makes you look kind of goofy, because you got a bunch of Republicans right now quoting propaganda from the Democratic administration, just like you had Democrats quoting propaganda from the Trump administration last time with Juan Guaido. So I don't know if y'all realize this, but you look crazy. Get it together.
Hey, come see us on tour. We're going to be in Chicago, Grand Rapids, Duluth, Georgia, right outside of Atlanta, and Jacksonville, Florida. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets. So they had an election in Venezuela. And the United States has been wanting to overthrow the government of Venezuela and control it because, well, they have more oil in Venezuela than Saudi Arabia. Okay? So keep that in mind. That's what this is all about, right? That's why we're sanctioning Venezuela. That's why we tried to overthrow their government. And that's why we recognized Juan Guaido as this is all about the capitalists want that oil. Okay? That's what this is all about. And here's Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He's going to say what a bad election it was. Watch this.
If my colleagues will indulge me for just 1 minute, I want to speak quickly to the elections that just took place in Venezuela. We applaud the Venezuelan people for their participation in the July 28th presidential election. We commend their courage and commitment to democracy in the face of repression and in the face of adversity. We've seen the announcement just a short while ago by the Venezuelan Electoral Commission. We have serious concerns that the result announced does not reflect the will or the votes of the Venezuelan people.
Boy, let me just say this. If he's so concerned about the democracy in Venezuela, wait till he finds out how his own party picked its presidential candidate. It's a real gut buster. Yeah, the party elite just installed somebody without anybody voting for her. Isn't that something? Yeah. Okay.
Critical that every vote be counted fairly and transparently, that election officials immediately share information with the opposition and independent observers without delay, and that the electoral authorities publish the detailed tabulation of votes. The international community is watching this very closely.
And by the way, when he says the will of the Venezuelan people, he's talking about a handful of people he installed there to bend the public will against his opponent. That's what he's talking about. Okay.
And will respond accordingly. Now.
So let's get out our decoder rings and figure out what this guy's actually saying. What he is saying
family. Appreciate the love.
is it turns out he means that actual democracy has overridden the takeover coup that he had planned over there. No wonder we're so concerned. Looks like we're going to have to get a false flag going over there. At a terror event on ourselves that we blame on Venezuela, giving Iran a momentary reprieve. So this is amazing. By the way, what in the fuck is it of any of your business how Venezuela runs their country? You guys don't have any problem with dictators. You guys have not, you're in bed with most of them. This is not about this is about, again, us wanting to coup a government so the capitalists can come in and steal their natural resources. That's what this is about. And don't be first of all, their election, every impartial election observer I can find says it's on the up and up. Jamu Baraka says, I'm in Venezuela as an observer and can say with certainty that after systematic interference by anti-democratic forces in the United States, we're the ones messing with the democratic process in Venezuela. As usual. You know any history at all about the United States and South America and Central America, if any history at all, it's the United States that's doing it. The election results represented the sentiments of the people who voted. What is not being reported is the organization that took place to win. Here's another guy, Alan McLeod. He says there are over 900 foreign election observers here in Venezuela, me included. If there was anything substantial to these predictable claims, we would have seen it. So, of course, the United States is going to come out and say that the election is fraudulent. That's, of course, what they're going to do. They do it all the time, every election. Instead, it is the same story every election since 2000. The United States says it's fraudulent and a dictator. And then I said, of course, the United States government and corporate media are saying that Venezuelans' election is fraudulent because Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia. And that's why the United States is constantly trying to overthrow their governments and sanctioning their economy, which is why 7 million people left Venezuela. And where do you think they came? Once again, the United States is the terrorists. Here's TJ Blade said, is that how you say his name? I don't know how to pronounce that. He says, one of the reasons we keep an outpost in Colombia, too. The plan to overthrow Venezuela and exploit its resources has been on their agenda since the 50s. He said, I started on a video compiling all the times we've attempted coups and assassinations there. It became an hour long. So then you have people like this who just buy the propaganda 100%. He says, I don't disagree with you about the U.S. foreign intervention. Okay, that's good. But you're wrong on this one. Okay. Sure. It's obvious there was fraud here. The people, my question to you is, why do you give a fuck about an election an election process in Venezuela? Because you're told to care. That's why. Because you're told to care. There was what's the African country? Somebody just got elected with 95% of the vote. We didn't say a goddamn thing about it because he's our puppet. Oh, I wish I can remember who that was. The people of Venezuela wanted out of communism. How do you know this? How do you know this? And Maduro had his military stop voting.
Sure. It's millions of people in Venezuela who want out of communism or socialism or whatever they're saying. Those are the descendants of the Spaniards. But then you have the indigenous Afro Latin individuals like Maduro and Chavez and them people who are the majority. They love the socialist, communist, revolutionary government. And they want to have programs for the poor. They want to make sure everybody got a house and an education and something to eat. And that, like Gaddafi, everybody can benefit from the resources. You see, the Spaniards, the citizens of the Spaniards, they don't like that. They want to benefit. They don't want the poor to get shit.
Voting, runoff with ballot boxes, etc. From what I'm seeing, what do you mean? What are you seeing? What are you seeing? Fox News report on this? Are you seeing MSNBC's? Are you seeing the Jeff Bezos' Washington Post? The people who lied about Russiagate at the top of? You mean those people? The people who lied about currently lying about Ukraine, lied about Libya, lied about Iraq, lied about Syria, and Iran? You mean those people?
Rwanda.
This Rwanda. This isn't just from the United States government and corporate press. Well, where else? Where is it from? So if you want to know the facts, Venezuela has voter ID. They have fingerprint ID. They have one day of voting at a designated location. They have a paper ballot trail. Electronic voting machines are not connected to the internet. Multiple audits and same-day results. U.S. elections have none of that. So you're being propagandized again. Why? Why do you even have a fucking opinion about an election happening in Venezuela?
What business of it?
But a government we've tried to overthrow a zillion times. Here we go. Here's Senator Chris Murphy.
You know, I feel like it's Groundhog Day in this committee. We've been told by the administration, frankly, multiple.
It reminds me of people who had deep emotional opinions about ivermectin. I had arguments with comedians, top of our lungs. It doesn't treat, but ivermectin is that's a horse paste. Why do you have an opinion on a medicine? Because you were told to. Same thing here. Why do you have an opinion on the Venezuelan election. Let Venezuela figure out their fucking problems. If it wasn't a good election, let them figure it out. They have way more safeguards in place than the goddamn United States, okay? So here, let's listen to what he has to
I
say.
feel like it's Groundhog Day in this committee. We've been told by the administration, frankly, multiple administrations for years, that Russia's support for Assad and Iran's support for Assad is tepid. It's fragile. It's just a matter of time before he falls. The truth of the matter is they were always willing to do more than we were in Syria to protect their interests. And that is likely the exact same case here in Venezuela. And so our policy has been misguided by fundamentally flawed assumptions from the beginning. And I have deep respect for both of you who are testifying before this committee. But we just have to be clear that our Venezuela policy over the last year and a half has been an unmitigated disaster. And if we aren't honest about that, then we can't self-correct. We have to admit that our big play, recognizing Guaido right out of the gate and then moving quickly to implement sanctions, just didn't work. It didn't. All it did was...
So he's saying, our thing to recognize an illegitimate leader of that country after we tried to do a coup and all the generals sided with the government. They didn't do, after we did that. And then we did economic sanctions on them. It didn't work. None of this is working. What does he mean by working? He means overthrowing the democratically elected government of Venezuela and installing our puppets. That's what he means by working. Why the fuck do we, again, that's just all the United States does, is meddle in other people's countries and governments. That's all we do, and that's exactly what this is.
Pardon Russia and Cuba's play in Venezuela and allow Maduro to paint Guaido as an American patsy. And a lot of us warned that this might happen.
Because he was an American patsy. You get that? That's why he was able to paint him as an American patsy, because Juan Guaido was an American patsy.
We could have used the prospect of U.S. recognition or sanctions as leverage. We could have spent more time trying to get European allies and other partners on the same page. We could have spent more time trying to talk to or neutralize China and Russia early before we backed them into a corner from which they are not moving. They're not moving.
So what he's saying is we could have strategically handled this better, so our overthrow of the Venezuelan government would have went better. That's what he's saying.
This is crazy.
We should have negotiated with China and Russia to make sure they would allow us to do what we wanted to do in Venezuela, which is overthrow their government and steal their natural resources.
Never gonna happen.
That's what he's talking about. That's what he's saying. This is how they talk in suit and ties and $300 haircuts. This is how they talk about creating chaos and being a terrorist organization, which is what the U.S. government is. He's talking about being a terrorist and overthrowing another country's government and bending it to our will, not the will of the Venezuelan people.
But all we did was play all our cards on day one, and it didn't work. And it's just been an embarrassing mistake after mistake since. First, we thought that getting Guaido to declare himself president would be enough to topple the regime. Then we thought
that's crazy.
We thought if we just acknowledged and recognized an illegitimate leader who wasn't elected, that would be enough to topple their regime, meaning overthrow their government. He's just telling you what we're doing.
Aid on the border would be enough. Then we tried to...
Saying Guaido was the leader of Venezuela allowed Britain to seize their gold reserves over $2 billion. So they seized that. Why? Because Guaido authorized it as the rightful leader of Venezuela. Because who said so? Because the U.S. and Europe said so. So then they stole the money, but they couldn't seize the country. So they said, we're going to steal your money that's outside the country, because Juan Guaido said we need to use it to help him and to help bring medicine to the. It was such a scam and a scandal.
To sort of construct a kind of coup in April of last year, and it blew up in our face when all the general.
We tried to construct a coup. We tried to construct a coup in Venezuela in April 2019, and it blew up in our face.
A coup, that's illegal. And they could have, that's an act of war. You're trying to overthrow somebody's government. What would we do if somebody do that to
He
us?
just said it. We tried to construct a coup in another country. What in the fuck? And there are people on Twitter right now, on my Twitter thread, not upset that we keep doing that, but think they should have an opinion on an election in Venezuela. You know who should have an opinion on an election in Venezuela? The people in Venezuela. The people who are the terrorists don't get to have an opinion. That's legitimate. Who gives a shit what this guy thinks or anybody else in America thinks about Venezuela's freaking election? This is all imperialism. That's all this is. Again, you're falling for it. If you believe that Antony Blinken is worried about the will of the Venezuelan people, you're a chump of the highest order, and you've learned nothing from Iraq, Libya, 20 years of Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine.
That's why I'm telling you, this is a prelude to war. This is what they do before they wage war on the nation. We got to help the people. We must help the people. We have got to. So right now they got the people rising up. They want Maduro to do some real violence so they can go to the UN Security Council like Libya and try to get the authorization to have some type of UN-backed peacekeeping mission. That's how it all happened in Venezuela.
Ukraine, you've learned nothing.
That were supposed to break with Maduro decided to stick with him in the end. We undermined Norway's talks last summer, and then this March we released a transition framework.
The Venezuelan military way stronger than Gaddafi was. And Venezuela ain't going for it, and that's why Russia and China have been beefing up their security and getting them ready just in case the U.S. tries something.
Framework that, frankly, is almost a carbon copy of the very one that was in front of the parties last year.
So, if you have an opinion,
and Cuba definitely fight,
and you're upset
Russia,
that somehow
Russia and China, nigga, Russia won't even Russia won't even be here fast enough before Cuba get there. The Cubans are OG revolutionaries. They wish America would try to wage war on Venezuela. Cuba definitely gonna get in, and they got some advanced weapons over there too.
Somehow the election in Venezuela wasn't on the up and up. You've been propagandized. That's the result of it. All of a sudden now you have an opinion about another country's election. That's up to that fucking country to worry about. I bet it involves us overthrowing their government again. I bet that's what this is all. You think that's where it's leading? I bet it is.
War on the continents of America.
Have you ever wondered what happened?
Before you overthrow their revolutionary government. The cartels will wage war on the southern border.
I'm sure you've heard a lot about what's been happening in Venezuela. You've heard about Venezuela being described as a humanitarian catastrophe, a brutal dictatorship, a socialist dystopia. But is that true? And should we trust the same media outlets that have repeatedly sold us wars based on lies when it comes to Venezuela? I needed to see for myself, so I went to Venezuela for 6 weeks to find out the truth. What I saw in many ways shocked me because the reality was so different to the media hype. I was told that the government of Nicolas Maduro had effectively lost its support base and was running the country through an authoritarian dictatorship. I was told there was no food and that supermarket shelves were empty. Yet, on my first full day in the country, I saw a very different reality to what I was being told on the corporate and mainstream news. There were opposition marches for sure, but it seemed like pro-government supporters were basically ignored and made invisible by the mainstream and corporate media. Thousands of people had gathered at Bolivar Square in central Caracas, signing a declaration of peace and basically calling on the United States and its allies to keep their hands off Venezuela.
They got million-man people militias too. Ready to fight.
Maduro, in my opinion, is president because of the elections that took place on the 20th of May.
We are here for freedom and peace, for the freedom of Venezuelans, because the United States is attacking us militarily under the facade of humanitarian assistance.
Maduro seems like God compared to Guaido, the devil, who is selling our nation for a few dollars.
I soon realized that the supermarkets weren't empty either. Over the next few weeks, ordinary
Revolutionary salute to 4K TV for the $4.99 donation to the war chest. It's LG Megan Thee Stallion was just shaking their heads at the Kamala Harris event. That's disgusting. I also seen Quavo supposed to been saying something now too. We'll deal with that tomorrow, but revolution is well life. I definitely appreciate the donation, family. We're gonna deal with those bootlicking shoe shiners who showed up at that campaign. Appreciate you putting that on my notice.
people to influential government officials all rammed home the same message. The Western media is lying about Venezuela.
Viva Venezuela! Fearing for their lives. Socialist dictator Nicolas Maduro claiming this evening that he has the military on his side, something that John Bolton just disputed.
This is now, according to the U.S. officials who were on that flight, one of the largest displacements of people in the history of Latin America.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the international aggression against Venezuela has always marched in lockstep with a campaign from the international media.
So what's really going on? Venezuela was propelled into the international news in January 2019, when the leader of the opposition-led National Assembly, Juan Guaido, declared himself the legitimate president of Venezuela a day after allegedly speaking to the United States Vice President Mike Pence. The declaration was soon recognized by around 50 UN member states, much to the dismay of the elected president Nicolas Maduro and his supporters.
At this time, the USA is interested in acquiring Venezuelan oil, different minerals belonging to the Venezuelan state, and thus is declaring us to be ruled by a dictator.
We, under our constitutional guarantees, have come onto the streets in peace. We've come onto the streets to fight for Venezuela, understanding that mobilization is the most powerful weapon we have as citizens to defend the revolution.
The Western media tries to pretend that these people don't exist, but unfortunately for them.
Revolutionary salute to our brother Kyle for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is well life. I appreciate the love, family. Salute.
They do, and they won't support a US-sponsored regime change. They're loud and proud and willing to defend their revolution.
Was this a brazen US-sponsored coup attempt against a resource-rich, socialist-leaning democratic government, or a constitutional transfer of power from an authoritarian regime aided by the international community? And has the Venezuelan government's failed policies led to it becoming a failed state with a humanitarian crisis forcing millions to leave the country? Households were divided about the problems within Venezuela. I spoke to a father and daughter. The daughter was supportive of Juan Guaido, and the father was a government supporter and very much opposed to Guaido.
The Venezuelans are wanting to get out of this problematic situation because we don't like it and we don't agree with all that is happening.
A lot of people see the internal problems within the country and they criticize based on feelings, but feelings and intuition isn't enough. You have to see the facts and evidence.
It was obvious there was a big division in the country. These political divisions played out through class and race. I found during my time in Venezuela that the poorer and darker a person was, the more likely they were to be a supporter of the government, and the wealthier.
You hear that? You hear that? The poorer and darker your skin get, then you likely gonna be a supporter of the government. I told you it's class warfare. Descendants of the Spanish conquistadors are siding with Europe in America, the indigenous Afro-Latin people are in charge. And I didn't know that until Chavez brought it up, and Castro spoke on it too. That's why he got his. That's why he loves us so much, because he know his roots and his ties to our indigenous people all over this planet. But you see, this is this all about. You find this everywhere. The Boule is trying to overthrow the government that's looking out for the darker, poorer people.
Yeah, and whiter they were, the more likely they were to be an opposition supporter.
The building on the left is the Constituent National Assembly.
whiter
It's
you
dominated
are,
by government
if you
supporting
white,
officials.
you love the opposition.
The building on the right is the National Assembly, and it's dominated by opposition supporting
Yeah,
officials.
you would never hear that on American TV. They never bring that up. They not gonna say that. They never gonna speak on that. But colorism is a serious problem on this planet. When I was first studying, I see this the overthrow of the Egypt Empire, the Haitian Boule in the Caribbean. You still had that colorism going on. That's a serious. We have it here with the Boule. We have it here. The colorism is a serious problem. But then the problem Latin America have is the descendants of the conquistadors. They are trying to keep Europe in power, even in Latin America. Mexico has that problem. Mexico still has that goddamn problem. The descendants of the conquistadors want to rule the indigenous Afro-Latins, the darker skinned people, even in Mexico.
Political representation itself. This is an image of the opposition-dominated National Assembly, and this is an image of the government-dominated Constituent National Assembly. I spoke to two Afro-Venezuelan women who were very concerned about what they described as a coup attempt by the white European elite class.
Even Colombia waking up. The leader, the vice president of Colombia is an Afro-Latin, and that's crazy. They siding with Putin. They siding with China. It shocked me. You know, the CIA is losing control of Colombia, but it's because wherever the indigenous, darker-skinned people of these Latin nations are coming together, they starting to rule these nations. That's really crazy, but that's what's going on.
Class.
We deserve to have conditions where we can have education, a place to work. That's our right. But unfortunately, racism has its place, and it exists in all parts, but particularly amongst the right-wing opposition. So of course we are concerned.
Look at that Afro sister right there.
There was anxiety of the prospect of the right-wing opposition taking power because of the murder of Orlando Figuera, an Afro-Venezuelan who was passing through the opposition stronghold of Chacao. Orlando was assumed and then accused of being a government supporter because he was black, and as a result was brutally beaten and set on fire.
All because he was black. They're not going to show that on TV. All because he was black. He was beaten and set on fire. Now, what did I tell you? Those are the anti-black hate mongers that they done let over here, bro. Those people, a lot of these individuals, they came to America. They told you the Venezuelans, a lot of them are these people who hate our guts and say we for the government. Yeah, they know black people is for all revolutionary governments if you're not the Boule. They know that. That's why they hate our guts.
Fire by opposition activists.
Nosotros vivimos de cerca el incidente de donde murió Orlando.
We live close to where Orlando Figuera died. We were close by and disruptions occurred. We had to run and take refuge in the metro and just leave the city.
Much of the recent political controversy surrounds the 2018 Venezuelan presidential elections, when the opposition-led National Assembly refused to recognize the election victory of Nicolas Maduro, who got 6.2 million votes. They claimed the electoral system, which former US President Jimmy Carter claimed was the best in the world, and which gave the opposition control of the National Assembly in 2015, was flawed, and therefore his presidential election victory was invalid. The US-educated Juan Guaido became the head of the National Assembly on January the 5th and declared himself president on the basis of Maduro's supposed illegitimacy on the 23rd of January. Interestingly, 81% of Venezuelans had never heard of Guaido before he declared himself the interim president of Venezuela.
Never heard of him.
The self-declared president was soon recognized as the interim president by around 50 UN member states, and then was soon demanding US humanitarian aid be allowed into the country.
Vice President Pence announced approximately $60 million in additional aid and assistance.
There are 190.
You see, when they just said $60 million in aid and assistance to Venezuela, That was the catch. It was from their own money that they seized and stole $2 billion out of Britain. How did they do it? By declaring Juan Guaido the president. And then Mr. Guaido saying, yes, we need that money to help feed. And then him and his people started eating. His people arrested right now for that scam. Serious business, a couple of his people got arrested. Then they started stealing the money. No Venezuelans ever got any of the money. See, America, this scam was ridiculous. 80-something% of the people never even heard of him. They said this is the president of Venezuela. It was so crazy because Maduro had the army, had everybody with him. This man here, he was walking around Miami, never in Venezuela. But then they let him walk around Venezuela a little bit, never arrested him, making a joke out of him.
3 UN member states. Only around 50 recognize Juan Guaido. 51 out of 54 African Union states do not, with the Kingdom of Morocco being the only exception. The majority in the Middle East do not recognize the self-declared president, with Israel being the only exception. In the Americas and the Caribbean, 17 nations back Guaido, but 19 nations do not, with the Caribbean in particular continuing their support for President Maduro. In Asia and Oceania, out of 33 nations, only Australia recognizes Juan Guaido. It almost felt that the majority of UN member states, which were non-white, continue to back the elected president, Nicolas Maduro. Countries like South Africa have been very vocal in showing their support for the elected president, Nicolas Maduro.
Solutions about problems of Venezuela lies with the people of Venezuela. It doesn't lie with somebody outside of Venezuela.
What do you think motivates the international bodies and states to recognize Juan Guaido or to recognize Nicolas Maduro?
Yes, in the case of the European Union, they have proved that they are subordinated to the United States. They may disagree on some topics, but when it comes to Venezuela, they absolutely do what President Trump wants them to do. The United States diplomacy is pressing every single country in this world, even Fiji, Palau, Vanuatu. They have told us that they are under pressure as well, but the African countries as well. The ambassadors of the US go to the ministries of foreign affairs and they press in order for them to recognize this fellow as president of Venezuela.
However, right-wing Latin American states were giving their full support to the self-declared president Juan Guaido, with Colombia leading the pack and demanding that the Venezuelan government allow in US humanitarian aid. Even multi-billionaire British business tycoon Richard Branson was also involved.
Help those who are hungry. And today, hopefully, on the back of this concert, we can start maybe getting supplies into Venezuela so that people are not suffering so much.
One problem was that the humanitarian aid was already coming into the country from Russia, China, Qatar, Cuba, and Turkey. Roger Waters, a musician and co-founder of progressive rock band Pink Floyd, was very critical of the forceful attempt to deliver humanitarian aid without the authorization of the Venezuelan government and the role of Richard Branson within this operation.
It has nothing to do with freedom, and it has nothing to do with aid. It has to do with Richard Branson, and I'm not surprised by this, having bought the US saying, we have decided to take over Venezuela.
So what was this all about? Was this a provocation aimed at undermining the Venezuelan government and showing that they were no longer in charge, or was it an attempt at causing the military to switch allegiances and declare their loyalty to Juan Guaido?
Gringo, go home.
I went to the Venezuelan border to see for myself. This is Simon Bolivar Bridge. On that side of the bridge is Colombia, and on this side of the bridge is Venezuela. It's been an important battleground of late between the Venezuelan army and so-called humanitarian aid volunteers. He has a gun. The border. I didn't realize it at the time. I was walking into a crossfire between the Venezuelan army and the Colombian side of the border, where bullets were inches from my head. There was a big controversy over the alleged burning of the humanitarian aid trucks, with the leaders of the right-wing coalition of the Lima Group Washington, and the mainstream media all blaming Nicolas Maduro's government and voicing their disgust at what they described as a cowardly act. US Vice President Mike Pence even said, quote,
"The tyrant in Caracas danced as his henchmen murdered civilians and burned food and medicine heading to Venezuelans. Saturday was tragic for the families of those killed and suffering Venezuelans, but it was just one more day in Venezuela's journey from tyranny to freedom. Maduro must go."
Yet, I visited both international border bridges and I saw the so-called humanitarian aid volunteers throwing Molotov cocktails at the Venezuelan army. So it seemed obvious to me that they were the ones most likely behind the humanitarian aid trucks being set on fire. Indeed, the New York Times all but admitted this fact 2 weeks later.
Everyone knew what the so-called humanitarian aid was about, but only when the New York Times told the truth did the rest of the world believe us and believe that it was like what we said, a Trojan horse.
My translator, who was meant to meet me on the border, went home because the bus he came in on was attacked by the so-called humanitarian aid volunteers. The screen has been smashed. And this third bus over here
Venezuelan
has been burned to a point that it's no longer at all usable. Yet that evening, when I went home, I saw this news report.
Set that bus on fire to express their outrage over the blocking of humanitarian aid deliveries by President Nicolas Maduro. Let's go to NBC's Mariana Tencio.
You hear that? She just justified burning down the bus. It felt like very sympathetic reporting for what could only be described as a politically motivated act of violence. No wonder the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, wanted no part of this so-called humanitarian aid intervention. Here on Santander Bridge, we've got Colombia on that side, Venezuela on that side. Now this is a truck allegedly delivering humanitarian aid. It's been burnt, decimated by so-called humanitarian aid volunteers. Now within this truck, we see whistles and wires. I've got 3 questions. My first question is this: why would a truck delivering humanitarian aid have whistles and wires in there? How's that going to help the people of Venezuela? My second question is, does this look like the work of humanitarian aid volunteers? Why would they burn a truck full of food if it was really just about humanitarian aid? And my third and final question is this: when the people of Gaza tried to return back to their homes in which they was ethnically cleansed from, the international media call them terrorists and they justify Israeli soldiers shooting them with guns. But here, when trucks like this try to enter a border illegally and the soldiers defend themselves, it's the soldiers that are demonized and the so-called humanitarian aid volunteers that are called the heroes. Why the double standards? Can you answer those questions? The whole world seems to be talking about a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela that I'd so far not seen. So after returning from the border, I went to a children's hospital to see how bad the situation really was. It was clear to me that the hospital was not in great condition.
Hace poco? Recently, an Argentinian child died here. He had an aggressive tumor that we could not treat because we didn't have access to radiotherapy. Of course, this affected us all because as doctors, it's our job to treat patients, and it affected me deeply and my mental health. The obstacles are unfortunate. They impose it on us externally. I know God is watching and we will be victorious on behalf of those who are unfortunately no longer with us.
These children in desperate need of medical supplies that have not arrived from abroad. And some might ask, should these children really bear the brunt of a geopolitical struggle they played no part in? The government blames healthcare issues on the sanctions placed on Venezuela and claims that financial transactions for medical supplies and equipment have been blocked by intermediary banks and financial institutions. I went to speak to the Vice Minister of Health to find out more.
As a result of their blockade, we pay 45% more for medicines than they pay in Brazil and Colombia. That means that the country must find even more resources to provide medication to our people. The last payment of the Pan American Health Organization was about $20 million. This wasn't received by them or the country we were buying medicine from, but it was retained, which means over 2.6 million were at risk of not being vaccinated. This money was needed to bring antibiotics, anesthetics, and surgical material to operate on over 180,000 patients.
The people of Venezuela have struggled with a lack of access to medical supplies, and this has been widely highlighted by the international mainstream media. However, what's less highlighted is the reasons why they struggle to get medical supplies into the country. Of course, some in Venezuela disagreed with this analysis and felt like it was just an excuse to mask over economic mismanagement and government corruption.
The regime of Maduro is the consequence of 14 years of inefficiency. Corruption was from both sides, and millions of dollars of the country's wealth was wasted. A lot of money came from all the oil Venezuela had, but that was when oil prices were high. This created the illusion of harmony and wealth, but once the oil prices fell and that money was gone, we were left naked.
Not all of the criticism of the government came from the right wing. In 2016, an economic team from the Union of South American Nations, UNESA, presented the Venezuelan government with a report out.
Why did the oil prices drop? Because the U.S. got Saudi Arabia to crash the oil market. Why? To hurt all of these nations, including Russia, including anybody that the U.S. was trying to punish. Saudi Arabia did it. And Venezuela was one of the main nations that they wanted to punish.
Outlining economic recommendations to revitalize the economy, which were never implemented, leading many to conclude that the government was too static in its response to the economic crisis. The hospital I went to had a generator for power shortages, and because of what happened next, that generator was going to become very useful. Between March the 7th and March the 10th of 2019, Venezuela experienced the longest interruption of its electrical system in the country's history. The government alleged that the blackout was the result of sabotage directed against the central computer of the main hydroelectrical power station at El Gurri in Bolivar State. Not everyone agreed.
This is the consequence of what has been the natural deterioration of public standards. The government departments have become redundant because they don't work to satisfy public needs and public interests, but to satisfy their own pockets. This is the institutional reality, the politics of our country.
Some argued that the blackout was conveniently timed. The opposition had called for a protest that Saturday. The announcement had not received the same enthusiasm as before, so many felt the numbers were going to be low and the opposition momentum had gone. The blackout happened on the Thursday, 2 days before the planned protest. The Cuban-American right-wing senator for Florida, Marco Rubio, was tweeting about the electrical blackout approximately 3 minutes after the electrical grid went out, before much of the country, including myself and the Minister of Information, Jorge Rodriguez, had even realized. Rubio's tweet said,
Alert. Reports of a complete power outage all across Venezuela at this moment. 18 of 23 states and the capital district are currently facing complete blackouts. Main airport also without power and backup generators have failed. Maduro regime is a complete disaster.
And they did it, knowing that it would leave Caracas vulnerable, so they sabotaged it. They sabotaged it to cause chaos in our nation.
For some, the government and their supporters' claims about it being an act of sabotage was just a wild conspiracy theory, whilst others online have pointed to the fact that in 2013, the popular video game Call of Duty featured in its storyline the same Gurri hydroelectrical dam. In fact, part of the mission was to install a virus in the electrical system to generate a blackout. Call of Duty creator Michael Condrey said,
"We brought in a lot of outside help. Military advisors, futurologists. We got together with a scenario planner from the Department of Defense who is active in the Pentagon. His job is to think about the future threats and prepare what-if scenarios for the US government. So we asked him, what do you think will be the conflict of tomorrow?"
Whoever was responsible for the blackout It was the Venezuelan people that were suffering. And the people at this protest seemed pretty convinced that the incompetence and mismanagement of the Maduro government was behind all of the country's problems, including the blackout. While so many government supporters saw the United States as part of the problem, what I found at the opposition protest was a belief that the administration of Donald Trump was part of the solution.
So the people behind me are very loud, very angry and passionate. Let's see what they're so angry and passionate about. Hello. So why are you here?
I came to fight for my children, for the liberation of my country, because we are tired.
I would like to thank President Trump for all he's doing for the Venezuelan people. Rescue us. Please unite and help us. Rescue us because people here are dying.
This is unlike any other protests I've been to in my life where people insult the president's mother and actively call for US intervention.
And one thing that they always say is that the government uses sanctions as an excuse to mask over their economic mismanagement and corruption.
We are human beings, and we are trying to build a new model, an economic model as well. So, of course, we can have taken some decisions that didn't produce some results that we expected. But I can say maybe that's 20% of the responsibility or less. But the main reason that you cannot find something in Venezuela, some products, is because of the blockade. I mean, we are producing oil, but then we send the oil and then we cannot get that oil paid back to Venezuela. I mean, they have kidnapped our resource.
Towards the end of my trip in Venezuela, I felt there was a shift in atmosphere, and Western journalists developed a more critical tone towards US policy in Venezuela.
And I'm wondering if you really don't see any kind of disconnect or inconsistency with the way the administration treats different groups of displaced, desperate people, because I would imagine if you went to the southern border, a lot of people would have similar stories as to the ones you heard today.
There's nothing like what's taking place at the hands of Nicolas Maduro.
Juan Guaido's protests also felt like they were getting smaller and smaller, and then this happened. Guaido boldly tried to organize a protest in a working class neighborhood called El Valle and was chased out by the locals. Guaido and his associates were ironically protected by the same Venezuelan police that he had criticized as being the enforcers of what he calls Maduro's dictatorship. After 6 weeks in Venezuela, it was obvious to me and to many people on the ground that the US-sponsored attempted diplomatic coup had failed, but it didn't mean that the US would give up on its regime change project.
We're not considering anything, but all options are on the table.
US President Donald Trump and US Vice President Mike Pence had repeatedly said,
all options are on the table,
which some regarded as a threat of possible military intervention. United States National Security Advisor John Bolton had explained very clearly how important Venezuelan oil is to US economic interests.
It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela.
During my time in Venezuela, I saw people struggling due to harsh economic sanctions, a move which was formally condemned by the United Nations, which the UN itself asked member states not to abide by. I met people critical of the government, many people supportive of the government, but overall what I witnessed was normal people living their normal lives and a strong sense of community, a complete contrast to the Western media's portrayal of Venezuela. I've been on a journey over these 6 weeks to find out if what's been reported on Venezuela is true. And from what I've found, it's been a damning indictment of the mainstream media. Yes, there are legitimate criticisms of the government's response to economic issues, but in my opinion, the title of dictatorship is wholly undeserving for this country. The crisis, from what I've found, has been a result of economic policies led by Washington involving various actors and intermediaries, and the group most affected by these policies, by and large, still support the government.
Coffee. Follow me.